The salt was the first thing Lykon knew each morning, and the last thing he tasted at night. It was in the air he breathed, crusted in his sun-bleached hair, and etched into the calloused skin of his hands. For 20 years, the sea had been his master, his mother, and his god. He knew its every mood, from the gentle, glass-like calm of a summer dawn to the frothing rage of a winter gale. But this was different. The air over the harbor of Aga was unnaturally still, thick as unsheared wool and carrying a strange metallic tang. The gulls, usually a raucous, wheeling cacophony, were silent. They huddled on the red-titled roofs of the city, their heads tucked beneath their wings as if in fear. The sea itself, the great turquoise expanse of the Aegean, lay flat and placid, but its color was wrong. It was too dark, a deep, brooding indigo that seemed to suck the light from the sky. Lykon stood on the deck of his own vessel, the Triton's daughter, a stout, single-masted trading ship that had seen him through more storms than he cared to count. He ran a hand over the familiar, sun-warmed wood of the railing. His ship was his only true home, a vessel of honest work and hard-won fortune. It was a speck, a minnow, compared to the leviathans that now choked the harbor. Today was the culmination of King Theron's grand ambition. A fleet the likes of which the world had never seen was arrayed in the bay, a forest of masts and a wall of timber. 100 triremes, their bronze rams gleaming like the fangs of some great beast, sat in perfect, disciplined rows. But they were merely the escorts, the honor guard for the true object of the king's pride, the Theron's triumph. It was a monstrosity, a quinquereme of impossible size, with 5 banks of oars, a hull of the finest cedar reinforced with bronze, and sails dyed a deep, arrogant purple, the color of royalty. It was said 1,000 men had labored for 5 years to build it, and that its hold was so vast it could carry the entire treasury of Aga. Today, it would join the fleet, the final jewel in Theron's crown of maritime supremacy. A great roar went up from the tens of thousands gathered on the quayside and the hills overlooking the harbor. King Theron himself, draped in a sea-green chiton and a golden pectoral chased with images of his naval victories, appeared on a high dais. His voice, amplified by the unnatural stillness of the air, boomed across the water. People of Aga, for generations we have been slaves to the whims of the sea. We have paid tribute in drowned suns and lost cargoes to the unpredictable tempers of the waves. We have prayed to gods who answer with silence or with storms. A murmur ran through the crowd, a mix of awe and a faint, collective shiver of impiety. Lykon felt the hairs on his arms stand up. Such words were dangerous. The gods were not abstract concepts. They were real, jealous, and possessed of long memories. "No more!" Theron bellowed, his arms sweeping to encompass the magnificent, silent fleet. "Behold, the might of Aga, the strength of mortal hands and mortal minds. We have tamed the forests for their timber, ripped the mountains open for their bronze, and woven the wind itself to our will. This fleet is our salvation. It is a testament that man is no longer a child cowering before the thunder, but a master of his own destiny." He paused, letting the cheers wash over him. His eyes, burning with a feverish pride, scanned his creation. Let the earth-shaker tremble in his watery halls. Let him look upon what we have built, and know that the age of gods is ending. The age of man has begun. From this day forward, it is not Poseidon who rules these waves. It is Theron of Aga. The final blasphemous declaration hung in the dead air. For a heart-stopping moment, there was only silence. Even the cheering crowd seemed to catch its breath, shocked at the sheer audacity of the king's hubris. Lykon felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine. He looked out at the horizon. The sky, which had been a flawless pale blue, was now darkening at the edges, the color of a fresh bruise. Then the crowd erupted. They were drunk on pride, on the spectacle of power, and on the king's infectious arrogance. They roared his name, their voices a single massive wave of sound crashing against the hills. But Lykon's attention was fixed on the sea. A single, long, deep swell, born from nowhere, rolled silently into the harbor. It was not a wave, but a lifting of the entire ocean. The Triton's daughter rose 10 feet, then settled back down with a gentle creak. But the great warships, chained together for the ceremony, strained at their moorings, their timbers groaning in protest. The unnatural placidity was broken. A nervous, choppy ripple spread across the surface of the water, and the deep indigo color seemed to bleed outwards, darkening the entire bay. The wind came next, not a breeze, but a sudden, violent exhalation, as if from a colossal lung. It tore banners from their poles and sent cloaks whipping. It carried no coolness, no refreshing salt spray, but a damp, sepulchral chill that felt like it had risen from the deepest, sunless trenches of the sea. The wind came next, not a breeze, but a sudden, violent exhalation, as if from a colossal lung. It tore banners from their poles and sent cloaks whipping. It carried no coolness, no refreshing salt spray, but a damp, sepulchral chill that felt like it had risen from the deepest, sunless trenches of the sea. "Cast off! Get the men to the oars!" Lykon roared to his small crew of 4. "We make for the open sea, now!" His first mate, a grizzled old sailor named Kaelen, stared at him, his face pale. "Captain, the ceremony." "The ceremony is over," Lykon snapped, his eyes on the sky, which was now churning with clouds the color of wet slate. "The gods have heard our king." Panic was beginning to ripple through the crowd on the shore as the sky transformed with terrifying speed. The sun was snuffed out, not by clouds passing before it, but as if a great hand had simply extinguished it. A twilight fell over Aga, a sickly, green-tinged gloom that leached the world of color. Then the rain began. It was not a drizzle or a downpour. It was a solid sheet of falling ocean, so dense it was difficult to breathe. The drops were as cold and heavy as stones, hammering on the deck with a deafening roar that drowned out the screams from the shore. Within moments, the world was reduced to the lurching deck of the Triton's daughter and the churning, gray water around it. Lykon wrestled with the great steering oar, his muscles straining as he fought to keep the ship's nose pointed away from the shore, away from the deadly tangle of the royal fleet. He could hear the splintered groans of tortured timber from the other ships, the sharp crack of masts snapping like twigs, the terrified shouts of men pitched into the maelstrom. Through the deluge, he caught a glimpse of the Theron's triumph. The pride of Aga, the symbol of man's mastery over nature, was being tossed about like a child's toy. Its immense oars, manned by hundreds of slaves, flailed uselessly against waves that were no longer waves, but moving mountains, liquid walls of black water that rose up and crashed down with the force to shatter stone. A sound reached him over the scream of the wind and the thunder of the sea, a sound so deep and resonant it vibrated in his bones. It was a bellow of pure elemental fury, the rage of a wounded god made manifest. The sea itself seemed to rise up in answer. Lykon looked up and his blood ran cold. Towering over them, blotting out what little light remained, was a wave of impossible scale. It was not water, it was a vertical cliff of churning darkness, its crest lost in the furious clouds. It held the shape of a colossal, grasping hand. and in its face, Lykon could almost see a pair of vast, merciless eyes burning with cold, divine wrath. This was not a storm. It was an execution, and the world was its chopping block. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the moment, suspended between the churning abyss below and the descending mountain of water above. Thought was a luxury. Instinct was all that remained. Lykon's voice was a raw tear in the fabric of the storm. "Hold fast! To the mast! To the rails! Lash yourselves down!" His crew, faces stark white against the gloom, scrambled to obey. Kaelen, his knuckles bleeding, fumbled with a length of rope, his eyes locked on the impossible wave. Lykon didn't lash himself down. Someone had to steer. He wrapped one arm around the thick, rain-slicked timber of the steering oar, wedging his hip against the stern rail. He felt the Triton's daughter shudder beneath him, a living thing sensing its own imminent death. "Turn her! Into the face of it!" he bellowed, throwing all his weight and strength into the oar. The ship responded sluggishly, its nose swinging around to meet its executioner. It was a sailor's last desperate gambit. Better to be lifted and swamped than to be caught broadside and shattered into kindling. The roar was not a sound, but a pressure that vibrated through the hull, through the soles of his feet, and into his very marrow. The sea ahead of the great wave was sucked away, and for a surreal instant, the ship dropped into a trough so deep that Lykon could see the barnacled hulls of nearby triremes exposed to the screaming air. Then the ascent began. It was not like rising on a normal swell. It was like the world itself was tilting on its axis. The deck angled upwards, steeper and steeper, until it was a near vertical climb. Water poured over the bow, not in a spray, but in a solid, crushing torrent. Lykon held his breath, his muscles screaming in protest, the sea god's cold fury trying to rip him from his post. He was climbing a liquid mountain, and for a heart-stopping second, as the ship crested the wave's colossal spine, he saw everything. The harbor of Aga was gone. In its place was a churning cauldron of death. The great fleet, the pride of a king, was being systematically dismantled. He saw the Theron's triumph, its arrogant purple sails ripped to shreds, lifted and then smashed down upon a dozen of its own escorts. The crack of its keel breaking was a sound that transcended hearing, a deep, final groan of a dying beast. He saw the high dais on the shore scoured clean by the wave's initial surge, and he thought he saw a flash of sea green and gold, the king, tossed into the maelstrom like a discarded doll. The screams of tens of thousands were swallowed by the god's single, unending roar. Then the world fell away. The Triton's daughter plunged down the back of the wave, a sickening, weightless drop into a valley of churning chaos. They hit the bottom not with a splash, but with a bone-jarring impact that sent a shockwave through the entire vessel. The mast groaned, threatening to split, and a seam below the waterline screamed as its timbers were sprung. They were afloat, battered, half-swamped, but afloat. Lykon spat a mouthful of salt water, his body a single throbbing ache. The great wave had passed, but the storm remained. The scene was a frenzy of cross-currents and whirlpools created by the wave's passage, a liquid battlefield littered with the dead and dying. The wreckage of the invincible fleet surrounded them. Splintered masts jutted from the water like broken spears in a field of slaughter. Drowning men clawed at floating timbers, their cries for help thin and pathetic against the wind. "Kaelen, report!" Lykon gasped, his voice raw. The first mate, soaked and shivering, pulled himself up. "2 men overboard, Nikos and Pheidipos. The hold is taking on water, Captain. Fast!" Lykon's heart sank. 2 good men gone. But grief would have to wait. He scanned the chaos, his mind racing, looking for a path, any path to survival. The harbor entrance was choked with the wreckage of the outermost ships and the remnants of the seawall, which had crumbled like dry bread. They were trapped. As if to mock their fleeting survival, the sky unleashed a new terror. A bolt of lightning, thicker than the mast of his ship and brighter than the sun, did not fork across the sky, but stabbed straight down. It struck the bronze ram of a crippled trireme 50 yards away. The explosion was instantaneous, blowing the front half of the ship to splinters and sending a shower of burning wood arcing through the rain. Another bolt struck, then another, each one finding the bronze prow of a warship with unerring, vengeful accuracy. Poseidon was not just drowning the fleet, he was melting it, unmaking it with fire and water. The lightning was a new, terrible pattern in the chaos. The god's rage was not blind, it was focused. It was aimed at the symbols of Theron's military might, the bronze fangs he had intended to sink into the world. And the Triton's daughter, a simple trading vessel of wood and rope, was being ignored. They were beneath the god's notice. "He's not trying to kill us," Lykon whispered, a wild, terrifying thought forming in his mind. "He's just killing the fleet." "It makes no difference. We're trapped in here with it," Kaelen yelled over the wind, pointing a trembling finger. A whirlpool, 100 feet across, was forming near the shattered seawall, its vortex sucking down wreckage and bodies alike. "We're doomed." "No," Lykon said, his eyes scanning the destruction. The great wave had done more than just destroy. It had reshaped. Where a section of the stone quay had been, there was now a deep, churning channel leading back out to the open sea. It was a narrow gap, a needle's eye, and it was flanked by the burning, lightning-struck hulls of sinking triremes. That's our way out." Kaelen stared at him as if he were mad. "Through that? Captain, the currents will tear us apart. The lightning." "The lightning is aimed at the warships, not us," Lykon countered, his grip tightening on the steering oar. He could feel the ship struggle, the sluggish way she moved as water filled her belly. They had minutes, at best, before she became uncontrollable. "The currents are our only chance. If we time it right, the outflow from the bay will carry us through. Man the bilge pumps, everyone. And you," he jabbed a finger at his remaining crewman, a young boy named Arion, "get a sailcloth and hammers. We need to try and patch that seam from the inside." It was a fool's hope, a minnow trying to swim through the death throes of a leviathan, but it was a hope. As Arion scrambled below decks and Kaelen began to work the pump with frantic energy, Lykon turned his gaze back to the impossible channel. He watched the rhythm of the storm, the pulse of the waves, the terrifying, predictable cadence of the lightning strikes. He had spent his life reading the moods of the sea. Now he had to read the mind of a god. He took a deep breath, the cold, rain-lashed air burning his lungs. He would not die in this king's watery grave. He would not let the Triton's daughter become another piece of firewood in Poseidon's funeral pyre for the age of man. The ship fought him, a dying animal resisting the leash. Water in the hold made her heavy and unpredictable, a dead weight in the churning sea. Every wave that slapped against her hull was met not with a buoyant lift, but a sluggish, wallowing heave. Lykon's shoulders burned, the muscles in his back screaming as he used his entire body to leverage the massive oar. He was no longer just steering, he was wrestling with the very soul of his vessel. "Pump, Kaelen, pump like your life is the price of the water in that hold," Lykon roared, his voice shredded by the wind. Below him, he could hear the frantic, rhythmic clank and splash of the pump, a desperate heartbeat against the storm's cacophony. He could also hear the panicked hammering of Arion, a small, muffled sound that spoke of a boy's terror in the dark, sloshing belly of the ship. Every second they delayed, the Triton's daughter sank lower, became less responsive. He steered not for the gap itself, but for a current he could barely discern in the madness, an outflowing river within the maelstrom. It was a dark, fast-moving slick of water that carried splintered planks and the bloated bodies of sheep from the shore pens. To enter it at the wrong angle would mean being spun into the whirlpool. He had one chance. A nearby trireme, its back broken, finally succumbed. It folded in on itself with a sound like a giant cracking a bone and sank, its bronze ram the last thing to vanish, pointing accusingly at the sky. Its descent created a powerful suction, and Lykon felt the Triton's daughter lurch sideways, pulled toward the new vortex. "Now!" he bellowed to himself, wrenching the oar with a guttural cry. He used the pull of the sinking warship, turning the ship's nose into the outflowing current just as it threatened to drag them under. For a moment, the ship hung, caught between two opposing forces, timbers groaning as if they would be torn from their pegs. Then the outflow caught them. They surged forward, a cork shot from a bottle. The acceleration was terrifying. The narrow channel, his beacon of hope, was now rushing toward them at an impossible speed. On their left, the hull of a burning quinquereme formed one side of the passage. Flames, whipped into a horizontal frenzy by the wind, licked out across the water, turning the rain to hissing steam. The heat was a physical blow, blistering the paint on their port side. On their right, the shattered, submerged stones of the quay lurked like jagged teeth just beneath the surface. "Arion, get up here!" Lykon screamed. "Kaelen, leave the pump. We need to fend off." The boy scrambled up the hatchway, his face smeared with grime and his eyes wide with horror. Kaelen abandoned his post, grabbing a long boat hook. Water immediately began to rise faster on the deck. They were trading time for passage. A huge splintered beam from a shattered mast, studded with bronze spikes, tumbled toward them in the current. It was as long as their ship, a battering ram in the god's own hand. "Starboard!" Lykon yelled. Kaelen and Arion, working together, slammed their hooks against the beam. The wood of the hook splintered under the impact, but they deflected the massive timber just enough. It scraped along the hull with a high-pitched shriek of tortured wood, leaving a deep gouge behind before being swept past. They were in the throat of it now. A bolt of lightning struck the burning warship beside them. The world became white light and deafening thunder. Lykon was blinded for a moment, the image of the ship's skeleton seared onto his vision. When his sight returned, the main mast of the burning vessel was toppling, a great black spear descending directly toward them. He didn't think. He yanked the oar with all his might, pulling the ship toward the submerged mocks he had feared moments before. The bottom of the hull scraped, a sickening, grinding sound that vibrated through his teeth. It was the sound of his ship being disemboweled, but it moved them 5 crucial feet to the right. The burning mast crashed into the water where they had been, sending a geyser of boiling water and fiery embers over their deck. One of the embers landed on a coil of rope, which began to smolder. Arion, without being told, threw himself at it, beating out the flame with his bare hands and crying out in pain. They were through. As they shot out of the narrow channel, the open sea struck them like a fist. The chaotic, churning water of the harbor was replaced by a different kind of violence. Here, the waves were immense, rolling gray mountains with valleys deep enough to hide a village. The Triton's daughter was lifted high on the crest of one, and for a dizzying moment, Lykon saw the sheer scale of Poseidon's fury. The storm was not localized to Aga. It stretched to every horizon, a boundless ceiling of bruised, roiling cloud from which rain fell in impenetrable curtains. The sea itself was alive and enraged, a single entity of destruction. There was no safety here. They had merely escaped the abattoir for the open killing field. The ship slid down the back of the wave, plunging into the trough. For a terrifying span of seconds, the walls of water on either side were so high they blocked out the sky, trapping them in a narrow, liquid canyon. The wind howled above them, a distant thing, before they were lifted again, up, 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 and exposed once more to its full, brutal force. "The pump," Lykon gasped, the adrenaline beginning to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-aching exhaustion. "Kaelen, get back to the pump." But Kaelen was staring past him, his face a mask of disbelief. "Captain, look." Lykon followed his gaze. In the troughs between the colossal waves, something was becoming visible. At first, he thought it was wreckage, but it was too uniform, too ordered. Rising from the depths were bronze spires, structures that defied the storm, glowing with a faint internal phosphorescence. They were seeing towers and battlements, the architecture of a city that had no right to be there. As they crested the next wave, the vision became clearer. A vast undersea kingdom was being revealed in the abyssal troughs, its gates opening. And from those gates, they were coming. Not fish, not men. They were tall, powerfully built figures with skin the color of sea-worn jade and deep black eyes. They carried tridents not of bronze, but of some darker, colder metal that seemed to drink the light. They rode upon the backs of great harnessed sharks and other, more terrifying beasts of the deep, their movements fluid and impossibly fast within the churning water. The Triton Guard, Poseidon's soldiers. They were not swimming, they were marching, an army rising to scour the surface world, and the drowned sailors of Theron's fleet were being swept toward them, the first tribute in a new and terrible war. Lykon's mind, trained to process the tangible threats of wind and wave, struggled to comprehend the sight. This was not a sailor's fable told over watered wine. It was a truth revealed in the heart of the god's fury. The ocean floor had peeled back its skin to show the bone and sinew of a power mortals had forgotten they should fear. The Triton Guard moved with a chilling purpose. They ignored the splintered wood and shredded sails. Their quarry was flesh. With long, barbed poles, they snagged the floating bodies of Aga's drowned sailors, pulling them from the surface with an awful practiced efficiency. There was no malice in their actions, no hint of battlefield rage. It was a harvest, a gathering of tribute owed. The drowned men, who had moments ago been the proud instruments of a king's ambition, were now just so much grist for a divine mill. "Merciful gods!" Kaelen whispered, his voice cracking. He made the sign to ward off evil, a gesture that seemed pitifully inadequate. "What are they doing with them?" Lykon didn't answer. He couldn't. The question was too monstrous. Instead, he forced his gaze away from the reapers and down at his own small world of wet, groaning timber. "Get down," he hissed, his voice a low command that cut through Kaelen's terrified trance. "Both of you, lie flat on the deck. Don't look up. Don't draw their eyes." Arion, who had been staring, mesmerized at the spectacle, flinched as if struck. He scurried to the base of the mast, curling into a ball, his burned hands pressed to his chest. Kaelen dropped to his knees, then flattened himself beside the port rail, his face pressed against the cold, wet wood. Lykon remained at the stern, a lone, vertical shape in a horizontal world of terror. He couldn't abandon the steering oar. The ship was still at the mercy of the colossal waves, and without his hand to guide her, she would broach and be swamped in an instant. He made himself smaller, hunching his shoulders, trying to blend in with the wreckage his ship had become. He was driftwood. He was nothing. He had to be nothing. As the Triton's daughter slid into another trough, the world changed. The shriek of the wind was muffled by the towering walls of water, and a profound, resonant hum vibrated up through the hull. It was the sound of the undersea city, a deep, choral thrum of immense power. The light was no longer the sickly green of the storm, but a cold, blue-white luminescence emanating from the impossible structures below. He saw colonnades that must have been miles long, supporting nothing but the weight of the ocean. He saw plazas vast enough to swallow Aga whole, and a central spire of black volcanic rock that clawed its way up from the abyss, crowned with a single, pulsating pearl of light as large as a temple. He felt a pressure not just on his ears, but on his very soul, the weight of 1,000,000 fathoms and the ancient, alien thoughts of the god who dwelt there. Then the wave lifted them again, back into the screaming wind and rain, and the vision was gone, leaving only a terrifying afterimage burned into his mind. They were sailing over the roof of a god's kingdom. A shadow fell over the boat, sharp and sudden against the storm's gloom. Lykon froze, his heart seizing in his chest. It was one of them. It had broken from the harvesting party and was approaching their vessel. It rode a thresher shark, whose tail, as long as the creature's body, scythed through the water with terrifying power. The Triton warrior sat astride it as a man on a horse. As it drew closer, Lykon could see the details. Its skin was not smooth, but covered in fine, almost invisible scales that shimmered even in the dim light. Its hair was a long, flowing mane of what looked like dark kelp. It wore no armor, only a harness of some dark, leathery material studded with pearls. And its eyes were the black of the abyss, ancient and utterly devoid of emotion. They fixed on the Triton's daughter. The warrior raised its trident. The 3 prongs were crafted from sharpened narwhal tusks, their points glowing with the same cold energy as the city below. Lykon's knuckles were white on the steering oar. He met the creature's gaze, his mind a sudden, stark calm. There was no plea to be made, no bargain to be struck. This was a force of nature, an extension of the god's will. You could no more reason with it than you could with an earthquake. The Triton circled them, its shark mount creating a wake that slapped against their already battered hull. It studied the simple, unadorned prow, the single stump of a mast, the humble cargo nets. Its gaze swept over the prone forms of Kaelen and Arion, then settled on Lykon. It saw his calloused hands, his salt-stiffened tunic, the honest, unpretentious lines of his working ship. For a long, agonizing moment, the black eyes stared into his, searching. Lykon felt a profound, invasive scrutiny, as if his entire life, every voyage, every prayer, every curse, was being weighed and measured. Then, with a subtle shift of its weight, the Triton turned the shark away. It offered no sign, no gesture of dismissal. It simply deemed them irrelevant. A piece of flotsam not worth the effort of sinking. It rejoined the others, who were now corralling their grim harvest toward the glowing gates of the city below. Lykon let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his body slumping with relief so profound it was painful. The immediate danger had passed. He looked at his ship. The scrape along the bottom had worsened the leak. The deck was awash, the water sloshing over his ankles with every roll of the ship. They had been spared by the god's soldier, only to be drowned by his sea. "Kaelen," he said, his voice hoarse, "get up, we're clear." The old sailor rose slowly, shakily, his face ashen. It just left? "We are not what he is hunting," Lykon said, his mind racing. They were beneath contempt, and that had saved them. But they couldn't drift here forever. The storm is everywhere. The sea itself is his weapon. There's no port we can run to, not on this coast. "Then what do we do?" Kaelen cried, his voice tipping into hysteria. "We sail until she sinks? We pray for a quick end?" "No," Lykon said, a desperate idea, a sliver of forgotten lore surfacing in his mind. He stumbled toward the small, half-flooded cabin, rummaging through a sea chest until his fingers found what he was looking for. A rolled-up chart, stained with wine and salt, but still legible. He spread it on the relatively dry surface of a crate, holding it down against the wind. Theron was a fool. He thought Poseidon was the only power in these waters. But there are older gods, places where the Earthshaker's grip is weaker. His finger, trembling with cold and exhaustion, traced a path north, across a wide, treacherous stretch of open sea. He tapped a small, crescent-shaped island, Samothrace. Kaelen stared at the chart. "The Isle of the Great Gods? Captain, that's a place of mystery cults and shadow priests. They say the gods there are not of Olympus, that they are older than the Titans." "Exactly," Lykon said, his eyes burning with a feverish light. Poseidon is of the new order. His rage is against the pride of men like Theron who follow the Olympians. But the gods of Samothrace, they are of the earth and the deep darkness. They are chthonic. They may not offer salvation, but their sacred shores might offer sanctuary. Poseidon may not dare to unleash his full fury on their domain. It was the thinnest of hopes, a scholar's argument against a hurricane. But it was a direction. It was a purpose beyond mere survival. "We'll never make it," Kaelen said, gesturing at the water sloshing around their feet. "She's dying, Lykon." "Then we keep her alive," Lykon snapped, his resolve hardening into a sharp, cutting edge. He turned to Arion, who was now sitting up, cradling his blistered hands. Lykon's voice softened. "Come here, lad." He knelt, gently taking the boy's hands. The skin was red and puffy, already weeping fluid. Lykon tore a strip from the hem of his own tunic, soaked it in the relatively clean water of a rain barrel, and carefully wrapped the burns. "You were brave," he said quietly, his eyes meeting the boy's eyes. "Does the sea god want to kill us all?" Arion asked, his voice small and trembling. Lykon paused, wrapping the last of the cloth. He looked out at the endless, raging sea, at the sky that was a permanent twilight. "He wants to kill pride, boy. King Theron told the god he was no longer needed. The god is simply proving him wrong. We were just caught in the argument." He gave the boy's shoulder a squeeze and stood up, his face grim. "Now we must get out of it. Kaelen, find every spare scrap of sailcloth and timber you can. Arion, you're on the bilge pump, one-handed if you must. Arion, work on the bilge pump, one-handed if you must. I'm going over the side."
"I'm going to patch this pig from the outside."
Kaelen stared, his jaw slack with disbelief. "Over the side? In this? You'll be torn to pieces before you can even find the leak. It's suicide, Lykon." "And staying on board is a slow death," Lykon countered, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. There was no room for debate, only for the brutal calculus of survival. "She's sitting too low. The next wave that breaks over us will fill us for good. We patch the hole or we drown. Those are the only choices the god has left us." He moved with a grim economy, stripping off his soaked tunic until he wore only a loincloth, his body lean and corded with the muscle of a lifetime at sea, but already beginning to show the bluish tint of prolonged cold. He found the ship's smallest hammer and a pouch of bronze nails, securing them to a belt. From the sail locker, he retrieved a thick square of canvas and a small bucket of the pitch they used for caulking. "Arion, keep pumping. The sound will guide me to the worst of the leak from the outside," Lykon instructed, his tone softening slightly as he looked at the boy. "Kaelen, I need 2 lines, one around my waist, another as a guide. Tie it off on that forward cleat and pay it out as I work my way down." Kaelen, his face a mask of grim resignation, did as he was told, his hands, gnarled but sure, tying a bowline that would not slip or bind. He did not look Lykon in the eye. To do so would be to acknowledge he was preparing his captain for his likely death. Lykon took the heavy, tarred end of the guide rope in his hand. "When I tug 3 times, pull me up, whether I am finished or not. Understand?" Kaelen just nodded, his lips a thin white line. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Lykon swung his leg over the splintered rail and lowered himself into the raging sea. The shock of the water was a physical blow, a cold so profound it burned, stealing the air from his lungs in a sharp gasp. For a moment, his mind went white with the sheer sensory assault. The water was not just cold, it was unnaturally frigid, a deep ocean chill brought to the surface, a cold that felt ancient and full of malice. He clung to the hull, his fingers finding desperate purchase on the weed-slicked planks as a wave crested over him, pressing him against the ship with crushing force, then trying to tear him away as it passed. He was a barnacle, a limpet, and the god's hand was trying to scrape him clean. He forced himself downward, hand over hand along the guide rope, into the churning green-black chaos. The world of the air, of the screaming wind and driving rain vanished, replaced by a roaring, disorienting silence, punctuated by the deep groans of the ship's hull and the frantic, muffled thump-slosh of Orion's pump, a tiny human heartbeat in the belly of the abyss. He found the gash by feel more than sight. It was a long, splintered wound below the waterline where they had scraped the submerged quay. Several planks had been sprung, and the sea was pouring through. It was worse than he feared. A canvas patch would not be enough. He worked in a desperate, breath-holding frenzy. When a wave trough passed, the gash would be briefly exposed to the air. In those few seconds, he would hammer a nail, smear a gob of thick pitch, fighting the suction of the water. Then the next wave would crash down, submerging him again, forcing him to cling on, his lungs burning, his vision swimming with black spots. The hammer felt impossibly heavy, his fingers numb and clumsy. He dropped a nail and watched it vanish into the infinite dark below, a curse dying in his throat as a silent stream of bubbles. In the depths, the storm's chaos had stirred the abyssal creatures from their sunless homes. As he clung to the hull, something vast and pale drifted past him in the gloom. It was a squid of a size he had only ever heard of in nightmares, its skin the color of bone, its single, intelligent eye, as large as his head, regarding him with cold, ancient indifference before it was swept away. Then came others, long, serpentine eels with needle-like teeth, and strange, gelatinous things that pulsed with their own faint, ghostly light. The sea was not just angry, it was vomiting forth its deepest secrets. One of the eels, mistaking his dangling leg for prey, struck. He felt a line of fire as its teeth raked his calf. He kicked out wildly, his heart hammering against his ribs, and the creature was gone. But it left behind a trail of blood, a thin, dark cloud that was instantly dispersed by the churning water. His lungs were on fire. His muscles, starved of air and warmth, began to cramp. He knew he had only one more dive in him. He took the pre-cut canvas patch, smeared it with the last of the pitch, and waited for the trough. As the water level dropped, he pressed the patch over the gash, a desperate, sticky bandage. He grabbed his hammer and drove in 4 nails, one at each corner, his arm a blur of motion. The hammer strokes were weak, the nails only half sunk, but the canvas held. It was a terrible, ugly repair, but as he clung there, exhausted, he could feel the powerful suction against the patch lessen. The torrent had been reduced to a steady, manageable leak. It was enough. His vision was tunneling. He gave 3 desperate tugs on the rope around his waist. Being hauled from the sea was as violent as entering it. Kaelen and Arion, who had abandoned the pump, pulled with all their strength. Lykon's body was dead weight, dragged and scraped against the hull until they could heave his torso over the rail. He collapsed onto the deck, a half-drowned wreck of a man, his skin the color of slate, his lips blue. He shivered so violently his teeth chattered like dice in a cup. "Get him below," Kaelen yelled, his voice thick with a relief that sounded like anger. "Arion, the wineskins, and any dry wool we have left." They bundled him into the tiny, dark cabin. The floor was inches deep in sloshing bilge water, but it was out of the wind. Kaelen forced the neck of a wineskin between Lykon's lips, and the raw, cheap wine burned a path down his throat, bringing the first flicker of warmth back to his core. Arion wrapped his captain's trembling body in a scratchy wool blanket, his young face a mixture of awe and terror. The man who had seemed as indomitable as the sea itself was now as helpless as a newborn. For an hour, Lykon lay in a stupor, drifting in and out of a shivering consciousness. The sounds of the ship became his world. The steady clank of the pump, now manned by Kaelen, its rhythm slower, less frantic. The groan of the timbers, the ceaseless drumming roar of the storm. He had won them a few hours, perhaps a day. He had patched the wound, but the ship was still bleeding. When he finally sat up, the world swayed around him. Kaelen stopped pumping and handed him a piece of hardtack, softened in a little water. "The patch is holding," the old sailor said, his voice gruff. "The pump is gaining on it now, slowly." Lykon nodded, chewing the tasteless bread. "The direction, has it changed?"
Kaelen frowned. That's the strange thing. An hour ago, maybe more. The wind is still a gale, but it's steady now, from the southwest. And the waves, they're still mountains, but they've lost their chop. They're organized. Lykon forced himself to his feet, pulling the blanket around his shoulders, and stumbled to the cabin door. He looked out and understood. The chaotic, swirling madness had been replaced by a terrible, disciplined grandeur. The sea was now a series of immense, perfectly formed swells, rolling relentlessly, endlessly, toward the northeast. It was as if the god had tired of his initial frenzied rage and had now settled into a colder, more implacable fury. He was no longer just smashing his fist upon the world. He was reshaping the very currents of the ocean, bending them all to a single unified purpose. Every wave was a gray liquid ridge, miles long, marching in perfect formation. The Triton's daughter was no longer being tossed. It was being carried, lifted, and borne forward on the back of the sea's new rhythm. "He's hurting us," Lykon whispered, a new, colder dread seeping into him. Their desperate flight to Samothrace was no longer their own. They were caught in a divine current, a river in the ocean, flowing in the exact direction they intended to go. It was not a mercy. It was a trap. Poseidon was not letting them escape. He was driving them toward their destination, and Lykon could only imagine it was for a purpose more terrible than a simple drowning. Every wave was a gray liquid ridge, miles long, marching in perfect formation. The Triton's daughter was no longer being tossed. It was being carried, lifted, and borne forward on the back of the sea's new rhythm. "He's hurting us," Lykon whispered, a new, colder dread seeping into him. Their desperate flight to Samothrace was no longer their own. They were caught in a divine current, a river in the ocean, flowing in the exact direction they intended to go. It was not a mercy. It was a trap. Poseidon was not letting them escape. He was driving them toward their destination, and Lykon could only imagine it was for a purpose more terrible than a simple drowning.
The sun never rose. Or perhaps it did, a pale, forgotten ghost behind the impenetrable shroud of cloud. There was no dawn or dusk, only a perpetual, watery twilight that painted the world in shades of slate and charcoal. Time was measured in the changing of the watch, the gnawing emptiness in their bellies, and the ever-present ache in their bones. They lived in a world of three sounds: the ceaseless roar of the wind, the rhythmic surge and fall of the great swells, and the steady, agonizingly slow clank slosh of the bilge pump, a sound that was both their torment and their only hope. On the third day of their strange driven voyage, Kaelen threw down the handle of the pump. His face, etched with new lines of exhaustion, was a grim mask in the gloom. "This is no escape," he rasped, his voice raw from shouting over the wind. He gestured with a trembling hand at the sea around them. "Look at it. This isn't a current, Lykon. It's a road paved for us." Lykon, huddled at the stern, the steering oar a permanent extension of his body, nodded slowly. He had felt it for days. The ship was no longer fighting the sea. She was a captive, allowed just enough freedom to keep her from foundering, while the swells guided her with an invisible, inexorable hand. "I know. He's taking us somewhere," Kaelen pressed, his voice rising with a frantic edge. "To his throne? To the deepest trench to be judged? This isn't sanctuary we're sailing toward. It's an altar." "Theron built his altar in Aga and summoned the god to him," Lykon replied, his gaze fixed on the endless procession of waves. "He thought he could challenge a god of the sky and sea, a god of power and pride. He made it a contest of strength, but the gods of Samothrace are not like that. They are not Olympians. They are the great ones, the Kaberi. They care nothing for the pride of kings or the strength of fleets." He shifted his weight, his injured leg sending a jolt of pain up his spine. "They are gods of the earth's secret places, of fertility and the dark womb of the soil, of the mysteries of death and rebirth. Poseidon rules the surface, yes, and the depths we know, But the deepest roots of that island are not his. His power, his rage, may not be able to touch a place that is not part of his story. We are not sailing to a friendly shore, Kaelen. We are trying to step off the board of a game we cannot win. His words, meant to reassure, hung in the air with little comfort. They were a theological gamble whispered against the roar of a god's certainty. Later that day, the omen came. Arion saw it first, his small voice a frightened squeak. "Captain! Ships!" Lykon's head snapped up. On the horizon, cresting a distant swell, was a fleet. But it was wrong. The masts were too thin, the sails too translucent. They were not sailing on the water, but through it, their forms wavering like a reflection in a disturbed pool. As they drew nearer, the horror became clear. They were ghost ships, woven from mist and memory and the sea's cold spume. Their crews were the drowned sailors from a dozen other ports, men who had died in this same great storm, their faces pale and their eyes empty holes of phosphorescence. They still manned their oars, pulling with a tireless spectral rhythm, forever roaming in their watery grave. At the prow of the lead vessel, a phantom quinquereme larger than any other, stood a figure. It was draped in the tattered remnants of a sea-green chiton, a spectral crown of gold flickering on its head. King Theron. He was not a king, but a figurehead of his own damnation, his mouth open in a silent, eternal scream of hubris, his ghostly eyes fixed on a horizon only he could see. Poseidon had not just sunk his fleet, he had conscripted it, turning the king's pride into an eternal, mocking patrol, a ghost navy to guard his victory. The spectral fleet passed them, silent as the grave, and vanished into the rain and mist. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. They had just witnessed a king's soul being chained to his failure for all eternity. Their own small struggle for survival felt insignificant, an insect's fight in a battle of giants. The sea offered other wardens. A pod of dolphins appeared, but they were not the joyful, leaping creatures of calmer days. Their skin was the color of wet obsidian, their eyes held a cold, predatory gleam, and their clicks and whistles were sharp and dissonant like scraped bone.
They did not play in the bow wave. They flanked the Triton's daughter, herding her, turning her back with swift, aggressive lunges if Lykon tried to deviate even a degree from the path the swells had set. They were the gods' sheepdogs, and the ship was their errant, stubborn sheep. Food was scarce. The hardtack was a pulpy, tasteless mush. The water in the rain barrel was fresh, but carried the metallic tang of the storm. They were wasting away, their bodies fueled only by fear and a grim animal will to live. Orion's hands had blistered and peeled, but he never complained, taking his turn at the pump with a silent, hollowed-eyed determination that was more unnerving than any tears. Kaelen had fallen into a stoic silence, his arguments exhausted, leaving only the work. Lykon felt a strange detachment, as if his body were just another part of the ship he had to maintain, forcing food into it, commanding its muscles to work, ignoring its pleas for rest. On what they believed was the fifth day, the air changed. The wind still howled, but it carried a new scent beneath the salt and ozone. It was the smell of land. Not the familiar smell of wood smoke and flowers, but something primal and strange. It smelled of wet rock, of deep caves, of soil that had not seen the sun in 1,000 years, and a faint, cloying scent of decay that was also, somehow, the smell of life. "Land!" Kaelen croaked, pointing. Through a break in the driving rain, it appeared. Samothrace. It was not the haven Lykon had imagined in his desperation. It was a black fang of rock jutting from the enraged sea, its peaks lost in the roiling cloud base. There were no gentle slopes, no welcoming beaches. Cliffs fell thousands of feet, sheer and unforgiving, into the churning water. Waterfalls, swollen by the endless rain, cascaded from the heights, not as silver ribbons, but as roaring, brown torrents that were swallowed by the waves. As they drew closer, the sea itself seemed to change. The great, orderly swells began to break apart, confused, as if they had reached a border they were wary of crossing. The water near the cliffs was a chaotic maelstrom of conflicting currents and undertows. The gods' road had ended, and it had delivered them to a place that promised to shatter them on its shores. The dolphins, their duty done, gave one last chilling chorus of clicks and dove deep, vanishing. "There!" Lykon shouted, spotting a narrow inlet, a crack in the island's formidable defenses. "A cove! We can ride the surge in!" It was another mad gamble. The entrance was barely twice the width of their ship, flanked by razor-sharp black rocks against which the waves exploded in plumes of white spray. To miss the channel was to be instantly pulverized. "Arion, get the sea anchor ready! Kaelen, with me!" Lykon yelled, his exhaustion burned away by a final surge of adrenaline. He aimed the Triton's daughter like a spear. He waited, watching the rhythm of the waves, feeling the pulse of the sea through the deck. He saw the pattern, the one wave in every 7 that surged higher, pushing a deep current into the inlet. "Hold on," he roared. He caught the wave perfectly. The ship was lifted and flung forward, a piece of driftwood shot through a sluice. The rocks blurred past, so close Lykon could have touched them. The sound was deafening, the roar of the surf confined and amplified into a continuous explosion. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. They were through. They were floating in a deep, circular cove. The water here was strangely, unnaturally calm, its surface like black glass. The sheer cliffs surrounding them muffled the sound of the storm, reducing its roar to a distant, angry murmur. The rain still fell, but gently now, a soft hiss on the placid water. For a full minute, the 3 of them stood in stunned silence, the sudden peace more jarring than the preceding violence. They had made it. They were alive. Arion began to sob, not from fear, but from sheer, overwhelming relief. Kaelen slumped against the mast, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. Lykon let go of the steering oar, his hands falling to his sides, numb and trembling. He looked around the cove. The cliffs were slick with black moss and strange pale fungi. There was no beach, only a narrow ledge of rock on the far side, where a cave mouth, dark and unwelcoming, gaped like a wound in the stone. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth and something else, something metallic and ancient. They had escaped Poseidon's rage, only to deliver themselves, battered and bleeding, to the threshold of something far, far older. The silence of the cove was not peaceful, it was watchful. The silence was a weight. After days of the world screaming, the sudden absence of sound pressed in on them, making Lykon's ears ring. His own breathing, ragged and harsh, was an intrusion. The ship's death throes were the only other sound, a gentle, melancholy lapping of water inside the hull and the sad creak of a timber finally giving way. The Triton's daughter had brought them through the god's teeth, and this placid water was where she had come to die. "She's settling," Kaelen said, his voice a dead thing. He ran a hand along the rail, a gesture of farewell. "The patch bought us time, but the sea has her now." Lykon nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He looked at his ship, not as a collection of wood and rope, but as a faithful companion. He saw the deck worn smooth by his own feet, the mast scarred by a lightning strike off the coast of Naxos, the small carving of a dolphin near the stern that he'd made for his wife years ago on a long voyage home. She was not just sinking, a part of his life was sinking with her. "We can't stay here," he said, forcing the words out. His gaze went to the narrow ledge and the dark maw of the cave. "We take what we can carry, the water barrel, what's left of the food, the sailcloth for shelter, and the lantern." "And go where?" Kaelen gestured at the cave. "Into the island's gullet? A quiet grave is still a grave, Lykon." It's rock, Lykon countered, his own resolve hardening against the old sailor's despair. It is solid ground. We have been on the god's water for too long. He turned to Arion, who had stopped crying and was now watching him with wide, trusting eyes. Arion, gather the flints and the last of the pitch for the lantern. Kaelen, help me get the skiff loose, what's left of it. The small boat they used for going ashore had been smashed to splinters, but a section of its hull was still lashed to the deck. Working together, their movements slow and clumsy with exhaustion, they fashioned a crude raft from the wreckage and a pair of spare oars. They loaded their meager supplies, the water barrel, a half-empty sack of sodden grain, the wrapped sailcloth, and the unlit lantern. And go where? Kaelen gestured at the cave. Into the island's gullet? A quiet grave is still a grave, Lykon. It's rock, Lykon countered, his own resolve hardening against the old sailor's despair. It is solid ground. We have been on the god's water for too long. He turned to Arion, who had stopped crying and was now watching him with wide, trusting eyes. Arion, gather the flints and the last of the pitch for the lantern. Kaelen, help me get the skiff loose, what's left of it. The small boat they used for going ashore had been smashed to splinters, but a section of its hull was still lashed to the deck. Working together, their movements slow and clumsy with exhaustion, they fashioned a crude raft from the wreckage and a pair of spare oars. They loaded their meager supplies, the water barrel, a half-empty sack of sodden grain, the wrapped sailcloth, and the unlit lantern. The water of the cove was as cold as it looked. As they paddled the short distance to the ledge, Lykon saw that it wasn't black, but impossibly clear. The bottom was a sheer, dizzying drop into nothingness, a vertical cliff that vanished into a lightless abyss. And the water itself did not seem to move. There were no currents, no eddies. It was preternaturally still, as if held in a state of perfect, fragile balance. When his oar dipped, it felt like he was breaking a sheet of ancient glass. They hauled their supplies onto the narrow, slippery ledge. It was barely wide enough for the three of them to stand side by side. Behind them, the cave mouth was a void, exhaling a cool, damp breath that smelled of deep earth and cold stone. In front of them, the Triton's daughter gave a final, shuddering groan. Her stern dipped lower, and the black, still water of the cove began to pour over her rails. She did not sink violently, but with a strange, quiet dignity. Her mast tilted, her prow lifted toward the gray sky as if in a final salute, and then she slid beneath the surface, leaving behind only a few floating splinters and a spreading circle of ripples that quickly vanished into the cove's unnatural calm. Lykon nodded, his back still to the others. He felt the loss like a physical amputation. He was no longer a captain. He was just a man, shipwrecked at the edge of the world. "Light the lantern," he said, his back still to the others. Arion fumbled with the flint and steel, his burned hands clumsy. After several attempts, a spark caught on a pitch-soaked rag. He carefully lifted the globe of the lantern, and a small, flickering bubble of warm yellow light pushed back against the oppressive gray twilight. It was a fragile, defiant flame against the immense, watchful silence. Lykon took the lantern and turned toward the cave. "Stay close." He stepped across the threshold, and the world changed. The distant murmur of the storm was cut off completely. The air grew still and heavy, the temperature dropping 10 degrees. The only sounds were the soft scrape of their sandals on stone and the faint, rhythmic drip of water from somewhere deep within.
The cave was not a simple hollow. It was a passage, its walls unnaturally smooth, as if bored through the rock by some great worm or carved by water over millennia. The lantern light cast their shadows long and dancing against the walls. They followed Lykon in a single file, Kaelen clutching a boat hook like a weapon, Arion keeping a hand on the old sailor's belt. The passage sloped gently downwards, turning twice before opening into a vast circular chamber. The chamber was so large the lantern light could not reach its ceiling, which was lost in a darkness that seemed to swallow the light. But the walls were covered in carvings. Lykon held the lantern high, and they all stared in silent awe and a dawning primal fear.
These were not the heroic, familiar figures of Olympian myth. There were no noble gods with human faces, no graceful nymphs or satyrs. The images were older, cruder, and infinitely more disturbing. They depicted stout, shrouded figures with no discernible features, their hands raised as if in benediction or warning. There were images of great serpents coiling around egg-like stones, and of a monstrous ithyphallic figure, part man and part goat, dancing a wild, convulsive dance. It was the art of a people who did not see their gods as patrons, but as terrifying, unknowable forces to be placated. "This is no place for men," Kaelen whispered, his voice trembling. At the center of the chamber was a pool of water, perfectly round, fed by the single slow drip from the unseen ceiling. The water was not clear, but had a dark, oily sheen, and from it rose the strange metallic scent they had noticed from the cove. Lykon knelt by the edge of the pool, drawn by a morbid curiosity. The lantern light reflected on the surface, but did not penetrate it. He dipped his fingers in. The water was shockingly cold, and it felt strangely heavy, almost slick, like thin oil. He brought his fingers to his nose. The smell was stronger now, iron, copper, and something else, something acrid and unfamiliar. "Don't drink it," he warned, wiping his hand on his loincloth. Arion, however, was looking at the floor. "Captain," he said, his voice small, "there are others." Lykon followed his gaze. In the fine dust near the edge of the pool were footprints, dozens of them. They were bare, human-like, but they were all pointing inward, toward the pool. There were no tracks leading away. And as he looked closer, he saw something else half buried in the dust, a small bronze clasp, green with verdigris, of a type worn by sailors from the northern isles. A cold dread, colder than the sea, colder than the cave, settled in Lykon's stomach. They were not the first. Others had fled the sea god's wrath and found this place, this sanctuary. And the island had taken them. "We will not stay in here," he said, his voice a low command. "We'll make camp just inside the entrance where we can see the light. We'll block the passage with the supplies." They retreated, the carvings seeming to watch them go, the silent, dripping pool a dark eye in the center of the earth. Back near the entrance, the world felt marginally safer. The gray light from the cove was a comfort, a connection to a world they understood. They set down the water barrel and the sailcloth, creating a low barricade, a flimsy psychological defense against the immense, ancient darkness behind them. They drank from their own barrel and ate a handful of the wet grain, the silence of their meal broken only by the sound of their own chewing. The ordeal had stripped them bare, leaving no energy for words. But as the perpetual twilight outside began to deepen into a true starless dark, a new sound began. It was not the drip of water. It was a low hum, so deep it was felt more than heard, a vibration that seemed to rise from the very bones of the island. It resonated in their chests, a bass note on the edge of hearing. It was the source of the thrum he had felt over the god city, but this was different. It wasn't the sound of power. It was the sound of something sleeping, breathing. And in their exhausted, frayed minds, they could almost hear a voice within the hum, a slow, deep whisper in a language older than Greek, a language of rock and root and darkness, inviting them to come deeper, to drink from the pool, to join the others, and be at peace.
The hum was insidious. At first, it was a simple vibration in the stone, a physical presence. But as the darkness in the cove deepened, the sound began to worm its way past their ears and into their minds. It was no longer just a frequency, it was a suggestion.
It spoke of stillness, of an end to struggle. It promised a peace as profound and final as the lightless bottom of the cove. It whispered of a cool, dreamless sleep, free from the memory of the storm and the fear of the dawn. Lykon felt it as a seductive weariness, a siren song for his exhausted soul. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, and the hum offered it, a final, perfect repose. He fought it by focusing on the tangible, the rough texture of the sailcloth, the sharp pain in his lacerated calf, the small, flickering light of the lantern that represented everything the hum was not: struggle, warmth, and life. Arion had curled into a tight ball, his arms wrapped around his head as if to physically block the sound. He was shivering, though the air in the cave mouth was still and cold, not windy. The hum seemed to be causing him a physical pain, a high-frequency torment the older men only felt as a psychic pressure. But Kaelen was succumbing. He sat with his back against the rock wall, his eyes unfocused, staring into the darkness of the passage behind them. His lips moved, forming silent words. "Kaelen," Lykon said, his voice sharp. The old sailor didn't respond. His gaze was distant, fixed on the great chamber they had left. "Kaelen," Lykon repeated, louder this time. He crawled over and shook the man's shoulder. Kaelen started, his eyes slowly focusing on Lykon, as if surfacing from a great depth. "They're waiting," he mumbled, his voice thick. "Nikos and Philippos, all the lads from the fleet. They found shelter. They're waiting for us. In the cool, in the quiet." "There is no one there," Lykon said, his voice hard as iron. "That is the island talking. The rock, the water. It's a lie meant to lull you into the grave." "It's not a lie," Kaelen insisted, a strange, beatific smile touching his lips. It was the most terrifying thing Lykon had ever seen. "No more pumping, no more storms, just rest. The water will make you whole. It washes away the salt and the fear." Before Lykon could react, Kaelen surged to his feet with a strength he shouldn't have possessed. He scrambled over their barricade and began staggering back down the passage toward the chamber with the pool. "No!" Lykon roared, lunging after him. He tackled Kaelen, their bodies crashing onto the hard stone floor. The old sailor fought with a desperate, wiry strength, his eyes wide and unseeing, fixed on a vision only he could perceive. "Let me go! They're calling for me!" he gasped, clawing at Lykon's arms. "It's so peaceful there." "It is death, you old fool," Lykon grunted, pinning him down. He pressed his face close to Kaelen's, forcing the man to look at him. "Listen to me. Listen to my voice. That sound is a poison. It is the sleep from which you do not wake. The men who made those footprints are not at peace. They are gone. Do you understand me? Gone." He shook him again, hard. The manic light in Kaelen's eyes flickered. A tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. The fight went out of him, replaced by a shuddering, racking sob of pure despair. He collapsed in Lykon's grip, a broken man. "There's no escape, is there?" he wept. "The sea or the stone, it's all the same." Lykon helped him back to their small camp, his own heart a cold, heavy lump in his chest. Kaelen was right. They had traded a quick, violent death for a slow, insidious one. The cave was a tomb, and the hum was the Undertaker's song. He made a decision. "We're leaving," he announced, his voice ringing with a finality that defied argument. "At first light, we will not spend another hour in this cave." "Leaving to where?" Kaelen asked, his voice hollow. "To climb those cliffs. We'll fall and break our necks before we get 10 feet. "We will find a path," Lykon stated. "This island has a heart. The water that drips in the chamber comes from somewhere higher up. There is a way. We will find it, or we will die in the attempt. But we will die in the light, not in this whispering dark." The gray twilight that passed for dawn eventually returned. banishing the deepest black from the cove. The hum receded with it, fading back into a barely perceptible vibration in the rock, its nightly serenade finished. They drank the last of their fresh water, ate a few mouthfuls of grain, and prepared to leave. Lykon retied the bandage on Arion's hands, which were now raw but healing. The boy looked up at him, his fear a palpable thing, but he didn't protest. He trusted his captain. The weight of that trust was heavier than the steering oar had ever been. Lykon led the way, climbing out of the cove along the narrow ledge, which widened into a treacherous, moss-slick path that hugged the base of the cliffs. The going was slow and perilous. The black rock of the island was sharp, like shattered glass, and it tore at their bare feet and hands. There was no bird song, no insect noise. The only sound was the distant, muffled roar of the storm-tossed sea beyond their sheltered cove and the rasp of their own breathing. The island was wrong. The few stunted trees that grew in the crevices of the rock had bark like charred bone and leaves that were a sickly, veiny purple. Pale, fleshy fungi, shaped like ears or cupped hands, grew in clusters, seeming to listen as they passed. The air was heavy, still, and carried that same metallic tang from the pool, but stronger here, as if the whole island bled whatever dark water lay beneath its skin. After an hour of climbing, the path opened onto a sloping plateau. Here, the signs of artifice were undeniable. Great, cyclopean stones, far too large to have been moved by any normal means, were arranged in a wide, sweeping circle. Some had fallen, others leaned at drunken angles, but it was clearly a man-made or something-made structure. An ancient, open-air sanctuary, exposed to the wrathful sky. In the center of the circle stood a single, massive stone, flat on top and roughly square. It was an altar. The stone was a deep, mottled red-brown, a color that was not entirely natural. Darker stains spread from its center, channels carved into the surface to guide liquid from the top down to the base. Lykon did not need to be a priest to know what kind of liquid it was designed for. The Great Ones, Kaelen breathed, his fear now mingled with a profound religious awe. This is their temple. They approached the altar cautiously. The hum was stronger here, a palpable thrum that rose from the ground itself. It made the air shimmer and their vision swim at the edges. Arion, smaller and lighter on his feet, was the first to reach the altar's base. He knelt, peering at something nestled in a small, carved depression in the stone. "Captain," he said, his voice hushed, "look." Lykon and Kaelen joined him. In the hollow was a small, crudely made bowl of unglazed clay, and inside the bowl, placed with obvious care, was a single, perfect scallop shell, its edges fluted like a fan. And resting within the shell were 3 drops of a dark, viscous liquid that was not rainwater. It was blood, and it was fresh. It had not yet congealed. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the rocks above them. They all froze, their heads snapping up. High on the cliff face that overlooked the stone circle, a shape detached itself from the shadows. It was not a man. It was too tall, too thin, its limbs moving with an unnatural jointed grace, like an insect. It stood for a moment, silhouetted against the gray sky, a shrouded, featureless figure, just like the carvings in the cave. Then it melted back into the rock and was gone. They were not alone. The sanctuary was not abandoned, and the god of the sea had not driven them to a place of sanctuary. He had driven them into someone else's hunting ground. "The Great Ones," Kaelen breathed, his fear now mingled with a profound religious awe. "This is their temple." They approached the altar cautiously. The hum was stronger here, a palpable thrum that rose from the ground itself. It made the air shimmer and their vision swim at the edges. Arion, smaller and lighter on his feet, was the first to reach the altar's base. He knelt, peering at something nestled in a small, carved depression in the stone. "Captain," he said, his voice hushed, "look." Lykon and Kaelen joined him. In the hollow was a small, crudely made bowl of unglazed clay, and inside the bowl, placed with obvious care, was a single, perfect scallop shell, its edges fluted like a fan. And resting within the shell were 3 drops of a dark, viscous liquid that was not rainwater. It was blood, and it was fresh. It had not yet congealed.
A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the rocks above them. They all froze, their heads snapping up. High on the cliff face that overlooked the stone circle, a shape detached itself from the shadows. It was not a man. It was too tall, too thin, its limbs moving with an unnatural jointed grace, like an insect. It stood for a moment, silhouetted against the gray sky, a shrouded, featureless figure, just like the carvings in the cave. Then it melted back into the rock and was gone. They were not alone. The sanctuary was not abandoned, and the god of the sea had not driven them to a place of sanctuary. He had driven them into someone else's hunting ground.
For a long moment, no one moved. The air itself seemed to have frozen, locking them in a tableau of terror. The image of the creature, its impossible height, its fluid, boneless movement, was burned into Lykon's mind. It was a denial of the natural order, a walking blasphemy against the shape of man. The fresh blood on the altar was no longer a mystery. It was a statement. A toll had been paid, and recently. Lykon's paralysis broke first. It was the instinct of a captain, the ingrained reaction to a rogue wave or a snapping line. Act or die. He didn't shout. A shout would be a beacon. He lunged, grabbing the back of Arion's tunic with one hand and Kaelen's arm with the other, his grip a vice. He yanked them backward, away from the altar, hissing a single desperate word. Move. Kaelen stumbled, his eyes still wide with a horrified awe, his mouth working silently. Arion was limp with fear, allowing himself to be dragged like a sack of grain. Lykon pulled them behind a cluster of leaning megaliths, stones that offered the illusion of cover, and shoved them down into the damp, mossy ground. "Did it see us?" Arion whispered, his voice trembling so hard the words barely formed. "Assume it did," Lykon breathed, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He peered through a gap between two of the great stones, his eyes scanning the cliffs above. There was nothing, only the wet, black rock and the gray, weeping sky. It was as if the creature had never been there. But the knowledge of it, the certainty of its presence, had changed the very air they breathed. They were no longer just shipwrecked. They were being watched. They were prey. "A god," Kaelen murmured, his face ashen. "We have seen one of the great ones." "That was no god," Lykon snarled, his voice a low, fierce whisper. "Gods do not scuttle into the shadows like spiders. That was a keeper, a priest, a thing that serves this place." He forced himself to think, to push past the terror and analyze the situation. The creature had been above them. It had seen them approach. It had not attacked. It had simply observed, then vanished. Why? The hum from the earth seemed to answer him. It was stronger here, in this circle, a constant physical pressure. It felt inquisitive. He remembered the feeling of being scrutinized by the Triton warrior in the storm, the sense of being weighed and measured. This was similar, but colder, more alien. The Triton had been an agent of a god's rage, a comprehensible, if terrible, power. This felt like the curiosity of the stone itself, the slow, ancient thought of the island awakening to the warmth of their small, frightened lives. "The blood," Lykon said, his mind latching on to the only concrete clue. 3 drops, in a shell. It's an offering. "To what?" Kaelen asked, his voice shaking. "To the storm," Lykon said, the idea forming even as he spoke it, a desperate leap of logic. To Poseidon, or perhaps to keep him away. He looked out past the stone circle, toward the cliffs that dropped into the furious sea. This place is a sanctuary, but it is not a gift. It has a price. This island, it exists in a balance. It pays a toll to the sea god to be left alone. A new sound reached them, carried on the damp air. It was faint, but unmistakable, the grating sound of stone sliding on stone. It came from further inland, from beyond the circle.
It was followed by a low, guttural chant, a rhythmic series of notes that held no melody, only a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to pluck at their bones. Every instinct screamed at them to run, to hide, to burrow into the earth. But Lykon knew they couldn't stay here. The circle was the creature's domain. To remain was to wait for its return. Their only hope was to move, to find a place of better concealment, and to do that, they had to go forward, deeper into the island's mysteries. "We go toward the sound," Lykon whispered. Kaelen looked at him as if he were mad. "Toward it? Lykon, have you lost your senses? We go away from it." "And go where?" Lykon countered, his voice sharp with urgency. "Back to the cave that tried to sing us to death? Back to the cliffs where that thing was watching us? No. We need to know what we are facing. We move slowly. We stay in the shadows. We see what makes that sound, and then we find a place to hide until we can find a way up and over these peaks." It was a leader's lie, a promise of a future he had no reason to believe in, but it was enough to quell Kaelen's panic. Nodding numbly, the old sailor got to his feet. Lykon put a hand on Orion's shoulder. "Stay right behind me. Do not make a sound. Step where I step." The boy just nodded, his eyes huge in his pale face. They moved like ghosts, flitting from the shadow of one great monolith to the next, crossing the circle and entering a narrow, winding path that led into a grove of the skeletal, purple-leafed trees. The path was paved with flat, irregular stones, slick with moss, but clearly laid by hand. The chanting grew louder, the stone-grinding sound more distinct. The path ended abruptly at a low cliff, overlooking a sunken, bowl-like depression. Lykon motioned for the others to get down, and they crawled the final few feet to the edge, peering into the scene below. The hollow was filled with them. There were at least a dozen of the shrouded figures, their tall, thin bodies moving with that same unsettling grace. They were gathered around a deep, circular pit in the center of the depression. A thick, greenish vapor, smelling of copper and decay, rose from the pit. And it was from this pit that the stone-on-stone sound was coming. As they watched, two of the creatures used long, bronze-headed poles to heave a massive, carved stone lid away from the mouth of the pit. The chanting stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. One of the figures, taller than the rest, who wore a necklace of what looked like human finger bones, stepped to the edge of the pit. It raised its shrouded arms and let out a single, long, wailing cry, a sound that was not human, not animal, but something dredged from the nightmares between. The cry echoed off the rocks, and in response, the ground began to tremble. The hum intensified, rising in pitch until it was a painful, physical blow. Then, from the depths of the pit, something began to emerge. It was not a creature, but a structure. A great bronze tripod, intricately carved with serpents and geometric patterns, rose slowly from the vaporous hole, pushed from below by some unseen mechanism. Atop the tripod was a large stone basin, empty and stained with age. Lykon understood. This was the true altar. The stone in the circle was merely a preparatory table. This was the heart of their ritual, the place where offerings were given not to the sky, but to the deep earth, to the chthonic powers that slept beneath their feet. The tall priest thing turned and gestured. Two others came forward, dragging something between them. It was a man, his body emaciated, his hair long and matted, his skin covered in ritualistic white paint that could not hide the angry red welts of rope burns on his wrists. He was alive, but barely, his head lolling on his chest. He wore the tattered remnants of a sailor's tunic. Kaelen let out a choked gasp beside Lykon. Arion made a small, whimpering sound. The man being dragged to the pit was not from their ship, but he was a man of the sea. Another survivor. Another soul who had fled Poseidon only to be caught in this island's web. He was the source of the blood they'd seen on the altar. The priest took a knife from its belt. It was not bronze or iron, but a long, sharp shard of black volcanic glass. It raised the knife, its other hand gripping the captive's hair, forcing his head back over the stone basin. Lykon's outworld narrowed to that single horrific image. He was a sailor. He was a captain. His life was bound by a code as old as the sea itself. You do not leave a man behind. But what could he do? He had no weapon but his bare hands. They were 3 starving, exhausted castaways against a dozen inhuman priests and the ancient, slumbering power of the island itself. To intervene was suicide. To watch was to let a part of his own soul die. He felt Arion's small hand grip his arm, the boy's entire body trembling. He looked at Kaelen, who had his face buried in his hands, unable to watch. And in that moment, Lykon's choice was made for him. He was a captain, but he was a captain of 2, not of a lost cause. His duty was to the living who depended on him. He put a finger to his lips, signaling silence, and began to crawl backward, pulling Arion with him. Kaelen followed, his movements clumsy with horror. They retreated into the garnered woods, their hearts filled with the silent screams of the man they were leaving to his fate.
They did not hear the man cry out. They only heard the renewed, triumphant chant of the shrouded priests, a sound that would haunt their dreams for whatever remained of their lives.
They fled with the frantic, silent urgency of startled deer. Every crack of a twig underfoot was a thunderclap, every rustle of the strange, leathery leaves a pursuing footstep. Lykon led, his body moving on pure instinct, pushing through grasping, thorny branches that tore at his skin, his mind a maelstrom of self-recrimination. He had seen men die in 100 ways, crushed by falling spars, washed overboard in storms, taken by fever in foreign ports. But he had never watched. He had never chosen to let one die to save others. The captain's calculus, he had always believed, was to risk all to save all. He had broken the code. The weight of the unscreamed scream of the man in the pit was a physical burden, bowing his shoulders as he ran. They did not stop until the chanting had faded completely, replaced once more by the island's oppressive silence and the distant, eternal growl of the sea. They collapsed in a heap at the base of a rock formation that resembled a stack of giant dark knuckles. For a long time, the only sound was their own desperate, ragged breathing. It was Kaelen who spoke first. He did not look at Lykon. He stared at his own hands, which were scraped and bleeding from the flight. "We left him," he said. The words were not an accusation. They were a statement of fact, flat and dead and heavier than any of the cyclopean stones in the circle. "There were a dozen of them," Lykon said, his voice a raw rasp. "We had no weapons. To show ourselves would have been to offer them 3 more sacrifices for their pit." "He was a sailor," Kaelen continued, as if Lykon hadn't spoken. "Like us, he probably had a wife, children. He thought he'd found a safe harbor." He finally lifted his head, and his eyes were not angry, but hollowed out, empty of everything but a vast, bottomless grief. "You are the captain. You gave the order to run." "I am the captain of this crew," Lykon shot back, gesturing between the 3 of them. "My duty is to you, to Arion, not to a ghost we had no hope of saving." The words tasted like ash in his mouth. They were true, and they were a damnable lie. He had saved their lives, but he had sacrificed a piece of their humanity to do it. Arion, who had been silent, began to shake. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat, a noise of pure animal terror. He scrambled over to Lykon, not for comfort, but with a strange, frantic energy. He grabbed the front of Lykon's loincloth, his knuckles white. "The blood," the boy choked out, his eyes wild. "On the altar, it was for the storm. You said it was a toll."
I think so, Lykon said, confused by the boy's intensity. No, Arion whispered, shaking his head violently. The priests, they were chanting. When they brought the man, He couldn't finish the sentence. He took a shuddering breath. The hum from the ground got stronger. The island, it wasn't paying the sea god. It was eating. The sacrifice was its food. Lykon stared at the boy. The child's simple, terrified logic cut through his own complex justifications like a sharp blade. The hum, the vapor from the pit, the way the ground had trembled. It wasn't a tribute sent outward, it was a meal drawn downward. They were not on an island paying a toll to Poseidon. They were on an island that fed on the men Poseidon delivered to its shores. The sea god was not their jailer. He was the drover, herding the cattle to the slaughterhouse. The new horror of it was so profound it was almost clarifying. Their enemy was not just the dozen shrouded priests. It was the island itself, a single, living, hungry entity. We need to get higher, Lykon said, his mind seizing on the only possible course of action. These things came from the low places, the caves, the hollow. If there is any safety on this rock, it will be on the peaks, in the wind, as far from the earth's heart as we can get. Kaelen just shook his head, his spirit broken. There is no path. Then we make one, Lykon said, his voice regaining a sliver of its old authority. He stood, pulling Arion to his feet. We climb, we do not stop, we do not rest until we are above this rotten grove. For hours they climbed. It was a brutal, vertical struggle. They clawed their way up rock chimneys, their fingers and bare feet finding purchase on sharp, crumbling ledges.
The strange purple-leafed trees gave way to a hardier, more twisted kind of vegetation, a wiry, thorny scrub that grew in dense, impassable thickets, forcing them onto the exposed rock faces. The air grew thinner, and the wind, no longer muffled by the island's geography, returned. It was a cold, clean wind, a welcome scourging that seemed to blow away the stench of the pit and the memory of the chant. They found a temporary refuge in a shallow overhang, a wind-scoured hollow high on a ridge. From here, they had a commanding view of the island. They could see the stone circle, now just a collection of dark pebbles far below. They could see the black gash of the cove where the Triton's daughter lay in her silent grave. And they could see the rest of the island, the tortured landscape of black peaks and shadowy valleys, all of it wreathed in the storm's eternal gray clouds. There was no sign of any other human habitation, no smoke, no fields, no paths other than the one that led to the ritual pit. Exhaustion finally claimed them. Kaelen fell into a fitful, groaning sleep. Lykon sat with his back to the rock, the sleeping form of Arion curled against his side for warmth, and kept watch. The guilt had not left him, but it had changed. It had hardened from a formless grief into a cold, sharp-edged weapon. He would not let that man's death be for nothing. He would get this boy and this old man off this island, or he would die with his teeth in its throat. As the light began to fail, he saw movement below. It was them, the priests. They emerged from the hollow in a single, silent line. But they were not returning to the caves. They began to spread out, dispersing into the twisted woods at the base of the mountain, moving with a terrifying, deliberate purpose. They were hunting. Lykon's blood ran cold. They knew. The creatures knew there were more castaways. The sacrifice had not sated the island's appetite, it had only whetted it. He gently shook Kaelen awake. "They're looking for us," he whispered, pointing down. Kaelen's eyes widened. The apathy that had claimed him vanished, replaced by the stark, immediate fear of the hunted. "What do we do?" "We keep climbing," Lykon said, "now." They pushed on into the deepening twilight, their movements clumsy with haste and exhaustion. The rock grew slick with a fine misting rain that began to fall. Lykon was in the lead when his hand, reaching for a hold above him, found not rock but cut stone. He paused, running his fingers over it. It was a block, perfectly squared, and set into the mountainside.
He looked closer. It was part of a wall, so ancient and overgrown with moss and lichen that it was almost perfectly camouflaged. Above it was another, and another. It was a staircase carved into the very peak of the mountain. It was impossibly old, the steps worn and treacherous, but it was a path that led straight up toward the summit, which was now lost in the low-hanging clouds. Who would build such a thing? The priests seemed bound to the low places. This felt different, older. It was a work of pride, a structure that sought the sky, not the depths. Up, Lykon commanded, hope warring with his dread, quickly. The stairs were steep and slick, a vertical ladder to nowhere. The wind howled around them, threatening to tear them from their precarious holds. They climbed into the cloud, and the world dissolved into a swirling gray void. They could see nothing but the few steps above and below them, their only reality the biting cold, the burning in their lungs, and the sheer drop at their backs. After what felt like an eternity, the stairs leveled out. They had reached the summit. It was a small, flat plateau, no larger than the deck of a merchant ship, and it was dominated by a single, ruined structure. It was the foundation of a watchtower, its walls crumbled to waist height, its stones scattered. At its center, a bronze pedestal, green with verdigris, rose from the flagstones. Whatever statue or beacon it had once held was long gone. But it was shelter. They huddled within the broken walls, shielded from the worst of the wind. They were cold, starving, and utterly lost, but they were high above the hunting grounds of the shrouded priests. As he slumped against the cold stone, Lykon's hand brushed against something carved into the wall. He held up the lantern, which he had managed to keep lit. The flame guttered in the wind, but it cast enough light to see.
It was writing, but it was not the crude, symbolic carving of the caves. It was Greek, old, formal letters expertly cut. Kaelen and Arion gathered around as Lykon slowly traced the words, his lips moving as he pieced them together. I, Anaximander of Miletus, built this tower to watch the stars, free from the damp whispers of the earthborn. I sought knowledge in the heavens, but found only the cold indifference of the void. The true power is below. It slumbers and it dreams. It drank my crew, and now it sips at my soul. It offers stillness. I offer defiance. Let my bones be a warning. Do not listen. Below the inscription was a crude star chart, and below that a final, chilling line. Poseidon does not rule the sea. He is merely its gatekeeper.
The words hung in the freezing air, more chilling than the wind that tore at their rags. Gatekeeper. The single word detonated in Lykon's mind, reordering the entire cosmos of his hatred. He had been cursing the king when he should have been cursing the throne. His rage toward Poseidon had been a simple, straightforward thing, a sailor's righteous anger at a violent sea. But this was a truth so vast and rotten it soured the very air he breathed. Poseidon was not the executioner. He was the bailiff, leading the condemned to a courtroom where the judge was the stone beneath their feet. Kaelen sank to his knees, not in prayer, but in a kind of spiritual collapse. He struck the base of the ruined wall with his fist, a weak, frustrated blow. Lies, he spat, the word half carried away by the wind. The words of a madman who died of cold. The Earthshaker, the Lord of the Deeps, a gatekeeper? He looked at Lykon, his eyes pleading for a denial, for a return to a world that made sense, even if that world was trying to kill them. He is a god, Lykon, an Olympian. He does not serve. He serves his nature, Lykon said, his voice quiet and dangerously calm. He ran his fingers over the ancient Greek letters, feeling the cold, hard certainty of them. Anaximander was a philosopher. He looked for patterns. He saw one here. The storm drives ships to this place. The island feeds. It's a cycle. A herd needs a drover, Kaelen. That is the pattern. That is the truth.
Then what do we do? Arion asked, his small voice cutting through the men's turmoil. He was looking at the last line of the inscription. Do not listen. How do we fight a whisper? Before Lykon could answer, a more immediate crisis asserted itself. A wave of shivering racked his body so violently it was like a seizure. The adrenaline of their climb was gone, leaving behind a deep, penetrating cold that had settled in their bones. The misting rain was turning to sleet, and the meager warmth of their bodies was being wicked away by the wind and the wet stone. The sailcloth, Lykon commanded, his teeth chattering. We make a windbreak, or we freeze before the priests find us. The task was a small, desperate act of defiance against the overwhelming forces arrayed against them. They wedged one edge of the heavy canvas under a fallen block of the tower wall and used smaller rocks to anchor the other side, creating a low, angled shelter. It was a pathetic thing, a child's fort against a titan's rage. But when they huddled inside it, the relief from the direct assault of the wind was immediate and profound. They pressed together for warmth, 3 shivering castaways in a ruined tower on the peak of a nightmare, and for a few minutes there was only the shared animal reality of survival. But Lykon's mind could not rest. He left Kaelen and Arion huddled together and crawled back to the inscription, taking the precious lantern with him. Do not listen. Anaximander had offered defiance, but how? This tower was his final testament. It had to be more than just a tomb. His gaze fell on the star chart. It was maddeningly useless. The sky had been a solid, featureless gray for days. It was the work of a man obsessed with the heavens, stranded under a permanently blindfolded sky. Why carve it with such care? Why make it the centerpiece of his final warning? A distant sound, thin and sharp on the wind, drew his attention. He peered over the low wall of the ruin, down into the swirling clouds that concealed the island below. The sound came again, the unmistakable scrape of a shod pole on rock, followed by another and another. They were coming. The priests were not creatures of the earth in habit only. They were scaling the cliffs, using their long staffs to find holds, ascending with the slow, inexorable patience of spiders climbing a wall. They would be here by morning, if not sooner. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to take hold, but Lykon crushed it. Panic was a luxury. He turned back to the tower, his eyes now sweeping the floor. It was a jumble of fallen stones and debris. But Anaximander was a man of patterns, a man of knowledge. He wouldn't build a tower to the stars and leave its floor in chaos. Arion, he called, his voice tight, bring the boat hook. Kaelen, help me. He began to clear the smaller stones and debris from the flagstone floor, pushing them toward the edges of the foundation. Kaelen, seeing the new, fierce purpose in his captain's eyes, joined him without question. Arion scurried out, his small form bent against the wind, and returned with the one pitiful tool they had salvaged. As the floor became clear, Lykon saw it. The flagstones were not uniform. Some were darker, some lighter, and they were cut into irregular shapes. But it was not random. He held the lantern close to the carved star chart on the wall, then back to the floor, his eyes darting between the two. It's not a chart of the sky, he breathed, a thrill of discovery momentarily overriding his fear. It's a map, the floor, it's the star chart. He could see it now. A cluster of lighter stones formed the shape of the Pleiades. A long, curving line of dark stones was Draco, the dragon. Anaximander, denied his view of the heavens, had recreated them at his feet. It was an act of supreme philosophical defiance. A beautiful madness, Kaelen muttered, staring at the floor. But what good is it to us? He wasn't just a stargazer, Lykon said, his mind racing. He was an engineer. A map has a purpose. It leads somewhere. He began to follow the patterns on the floor, trying to understand their meaning. His gaze kept returning to the inscription. I sought knowledge in the heavens, but found only the cold indifference of the void. The void. Where was the void on this map? Most of the constellations were represented, but there was one section of the floor, near the bronze pedestal, that seemed deliberately empty.
It was a space between constellations, a patch of plain, unadorned flagstones. The void. He crawled to the pedestal. It was set in the center of a large circular stone, which in turn was the center of the entire floor map. He ran his hands over the empty flagstones representing the void. They seemed no different from the others. He pushed on them. Nothing. He used the boat hook to pry at their edges, but they were seated as firmly as the mountain itself. The scraping sounds from below were closer now. He could hear their guttural, rhythmic grunts, the sounds of their effort as they climbed. Lykon, they're almost here, Kaelen hissed, his face pale in the lantern light. The pedestal, Lykon said, ignoring him. His eyes were locked on the green bronze base where a statue had once stood. It was perfectly round, but there was a single, small notch cut into its rim. A mark. What did it point to? He followed its line of sight. It pointed directly at the star chart on the wall. No, not the whole chart. It pointed at a single, specific star carved within the constellation of the Great Bear. A star that was carved deeper than all the others, almost drilled into the stone. Ursa Major, the Great Bear. But sailors called it the Wain, the wagon, the constellation that showed the way home. He scrambled back to the wall, his fingers probing the deeply carved hole. He felt something move, a small stone button cunningly hidden in the depiction of the star. He pressed it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low, grinding groan that echoed the sound of the pit in the hollow, the large circular stone at the base of the pedestal began to rotate. It moved slowly, ponderously, powered by some ancient hidden counterweight. It turned a quarter of a circle and then stopped with a heavy thud that vibrated through their bones. Where the patch of void flagstones had been, there was now a dark rectangular opening. A section of the floor had lowered, revealing a set of steep, narrow stairs leading down into the heart of the mountain. A breath of air, stale and cold, but free of the island's metallic taint, wafted up to greet them. Anaximander's final act of defiance. It was not a tower to reach the heavens. It was a secret door to escape the earth. A path down, but not into the island's hungry heart. A different way. The first of the priests hauled itself over the edge of the plateau. It was a black silhouette against the gray swirling mist, its shrouded head turning slowly, its long limbs unfolding like a nightmare. "Go," Lykon warned, grabbing the lantern. "Arion, you first. Kaelen right behind him. Move." Arion scrambled into the opening without hesitation. Kaelen followed, his big frame barely fitting through the gap. Lykon took one last look at the creature as it took a step toward them, its movements silent and unnaturally smooth.
He lifted a heavy, broken piece of the tower wall, a stone as big as his chest, and with a final, defiant roar, he heaved it at the rotating mechanism of the pedestal. There was a crunch of stone and a shriek of protesting bronze. The great circular stone shuddered and began to slowly, agonizingly grind its way back into place. Lykon threw himself into the opening, tumbling down the first few steps. Above him, he heard the heavy slab of the floor thud back into its closed position, plunging them into absolute, suffocating darkness just as the first of the shrouded priests reached the tower. The last thing he heard from the world above was a high, frustrated shriek that was not made by any human throat. Then, silence.
The darkness was absolute. It was not the mere absence of light. It was a physical substance, a thick, cold fluid that filled Lykon's lungs and pressed against his eardrums. The shriek of the priest and the grinding of the stone door were gone, swallowed by a silence so profound it felt like the end of the world. For a horrifying second, he thought he had been struck blind and deaf. Then he felt the solid reality of the stone step beneath his hip and the small, trembling weight of Arion crashing into his back. "The lantern!" Kaelen's voice was a disembodied, panicked gasp in the void. "Lykon, the lantern!" Lykon fumbled in the dark, his hands shaking.
The metal was cold. His thumb found the catch on the globe. He felt for the flint and steel in his belt pouch, his movements clumsy and slow. The scrape of steel on flint was a shocking intrusion, a desecration of the tomb-like silence. A spark. Another. On the third try, the wick caught and a tiny wavering flame blossomed into life. The yellow light pushed the oppressive blackness back a few feet, creating a small, fragile bubble of existence. They were in a narrow, perfectly square tunnel, its walls and ceiling made of the same expertly cut stone as the tower. The stairs descended steeply into the darkness beyond the lantern's reach. Dust motes, ancient and undisturbed, danced in the beam. The air was utterly still, carrying the scent of cold stone and deep, dry earth. There was no trace of the island's metallic tang. "Did you—" Kaelen started, looking up the short flight of stairs toward the sealed ceiling. "Did you break it?" "I tried," Lykon said, getting to his feet and pulling Arion up with him. "I don't know if it's broken for good or just jammed. It doesn't matter. There's no going back." "We're buried alive," Kaelen whispered, the reality of their situation crashing down on him. He placed a hand on the stone wall as if to steady a reeling world. "This isn't a path. It's a grave Anaximander dug for himself and for us." "He carved a way out, not a way in," Lykon countered, his voice sharp. He held the lantern high, its light casting their shadows long and distorted down the endless steps. "This passage leads somewhere. We follow it." The descent was a monotonous, hypnotic ordeal. There were no carvings on the walls, no side passages, just the unending repetition of stone steps, each one identical to the last. They were cut with a mathematician's precision, their slope constant, their width unwavering. It was the work of a man who found solace in order, a stark contrast to the chaotic, organic malevolence of the island above. Their footsteps, the only sound, echoed in the narrow space, creating the unsettling illusion that they were not alone, that phantom companions were descending just behind them. They lost all track of time. Hours bled into one another, marked only by their growing fatigue and the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. They paused twice to drink sparingly from their water barrel, which Kaelen had somehow managed to wrestle down the stairs with them. The silence during these stops was worse than the noise of their descent. It was a listening silence, and Lykon found himself straining to hear the scrape of stone from above, the sign that the priests had found a way to follow. But there was nothing. It was Arion who spotted the change. "The wall," he said, his voice hoarse. He pointed. Lykon held the lantern closer. A thin vertical seam, almost invisible, broke the smooth continuity of the stone. He pushed against it. A section of the wall, perfectly balanced on a hidden pivot, swung inward with a soft whisper of sound. It opened into a small, square chamber, no larger than a ship's cabin. The air inside was even more still, thick with the dry, papery scent of immense age. In the center of the room, seated at a simple stone table, was a human skeleton. It was slumped forward, its skull resting on a large, flat clay tablet, as if the man had fallen asleep while reading. The bones were clean and pale, draped in the rotted, gossamer-thin remnants of a fine woolen chaton. A simple bronze stylus lay near its skeletal hand. Anaximander. He had not died of cold in the tower above, but here, in the quiet solitude of his secret study. "Gods preserve us," Kaelen breathed, shrinking back from the doorway. "He never escaped. This is the end of the path." "No," Lykon said, stepping into the chamber with a strange sense of reverence. He felt not fear, but a connection to this long-dead philosopher. This is a stop along the way. He died here, but he died at his work. He gently lifted the skull. It was light as a seashell. Beneath it, the clay tablet was covered in the same neat, precise script as the inscription in the tower, but this was a different text. It was a log, a record of observations. Lykon's reading was slow, the formal, philosophical Greek a challenge, but the meaning was clear and terrifying.
The entity is not sentient in the way of a man or a god, Anaximander had written. It does not think. It hungers. It does not speak. It resonates. The hum is the vibration of its slow, deep life, a frequency that attunes the minds of the weak to its own base desire, stillness, consumption, peace. There were diagrams of the shrouded priests, whom Anaximander called the shepherds, speculating that they were not a separate race, but men, long ago castaways, whose bodies and minds had been warped over generations by the island's influence, transforming them into mindless extensions of its will. On a second tablet, he had mapped the island's interior. It was a cross-section, a drawing of the mountain they were in. It showed the caves, the ritual pit, and a network of dark, pulsing lines he labeled veins, all converging on a central point deep in the rock, which he called the core, the heart. "He mapped our prison," Lykon murmured, tracing the lines with a finger. But it was the third tablet that made his blood run cold. It was a diagram of a complex device made of bronze rings and what looked like tuned metal strings, like a lyre. Beneath it, a chilling entry. It has a voice, and so it can be deafened. It has a harmony, and so it can be broken. A counter-resonance, a dissonant chord struck at the core, could disrupt the shepherds, perhaps even put the entity into a deeper slumber. But the materials are beyond me. The knowledge is insufficient. I can only build the path away from it, not the weapon against it. He was trying to fight it, Lykon said, a new wild hope kindling in his chest. "He died, Lykon," Kaelen said, his voice flat. "He died in this chair, in this hole, with his maps and his mad ideas. We have no water left. The grain is almost gone. We are just following his footsteps to a different part of the same grave." "Look at the map," Lykon insisted, turning to the old sailor, his eyes burning with an intensity Kaelen had not seen since the height of the storm. "Look where this passage goes." He pointed with the stylus. The tunnel they were in descended sharply, then leveled out, running parallel to one of the island's veins. It bypassed the core completely, hugging the outer edge of the mountain's core. And it ended, not in a blank wall, but at the coast, opening into what the diagram clearly marked as a sea cave, far below the cliffs, its entrance hidden at high tide. "He didn't die of despair, Kaelen. He built a way out. He just ran out of time." Arion, who had been quietly exploring the small chamber, let out a small gasp. "Captain, over here!" He was pointing to a corner, behind a stack of crumbling papyrus scrolls that had mostly turned to dust. There, built into the wall, was a cistern. A stone lid covered it. Lykon and Kaelen rushed over and heaved the heavy lid aside. Inside, the cistern was a quarter full of clear, clean water. It was rainwater, channeled down from the tower by some ingenious hidden pipe system Anaximander had built into his staircase. It was cool and tasted only of stone, a life-giving miracle in the depths of the earth. They drank deeply and gratefully, the water washing the dust from their throats and reviving their spirits more than any words of hope could have. It was proof. Anaximander had planned for a long journey. He had provided for those who would follow. As Kaelen refilled their water barrel, Lykon examined the skeleton again. He saw now that the philosopher's death had not been entirely peaceful. The finger bones of his right hand were curled tightly, as if he had been gripping the stylus in a moment of sudden, final revelation. The stylus itself was not resting on the tablet. Its sharp point was pressed into a specific symbol on the map of the island's veins. It was a symbol he had not noticed before, a small circle with a jagged line, like a lightning bolt, drawn through it, located in a narrow passage just before the core.
Next to it, Anaximander had scratched a single, final word into the clay. Kephalos. "Kaelen," Lykon said slowly, his mind racing to connect the pieces. "What do you know of the Kephalos?" Kaelen paused, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand.
The Kephalos? It's a myth, a story for children. The lightning stone. They say Hephaestus forged it from a piece of Zeus's own thunderbolt, that it holds the storm inside it. A fable. Anaximander didn't believe in fables, Lykon said, his gaze fixed on the map, on the dead man's final, desperate message. He looked from the map to the diagram of the resonance device. A dissonant chord, a stone that holds the storm, a weapon. He didn't find his weapon, he whispered. He found where it was hidden.
The debate was not loud, but it filled the small stone chamber with a pressure greater than tons of rock. It was the collision of two opposing forms of survival, Kaelen's desperate pragmatism against Lykon's newfound terrible purpose. "He built a path to the sea, Lykon," Kaelen argued, his voice a low, pleading growl. He gestured with a dripping ladle toward the map on the tablet. "A gift from a dead man to let us live. And you want to ignore it? You want to turn aside and chase a child's tale about a magic rock? To walk into the very guts of the thing that wants to eat us?" "That path leads to the sea, yes," Lykon countered, his voice steady. He stood over the skeleton of Anaximander, his hand resting on the back of the stone chair, as if drawing strength from the dead philosopher. "And what then? We build a raft from driftwood and hope the gatekeeper doesn't notice us sneaking out his back door? Hope he doesn't send another storm to smash us against the rocks or drive us right back to this shore? That isn't escape, Kaelen. It's a reprieve, a short one." "A reprieve is better than a tomb," Kaelen slammed the ladle down, water splashing on the stone floor. "Think of the boy. We have a duty to him." Lykon's gaze softened as he looked at Arion. The boy was watching them, his eyes wide, shifting from one man to the other. He wasn't looking at them like a child watching his elders argue. He was weighing their words, judging their arguments. "My duty is to get him home," Lykon said, his eyes returning to Kaelen, the steel back in his voice. "Not just away from this island, but home. Past Poseidon, past whatever else is waiting in the deep." Anaximander spent his life studying this place. With his last breath, he pointed us to a weapon. He didn't scratch sea cave into the clay. He scratched Kephalos. He was a man of reason. If he believed in it, then it is more than a myth. It is our only real chance. He knelt in front of Arion. "This will be more dangerous," he said, his voice direct and honest. "The path to the sea is longer, but it may be safer. The path to the stone is a detour into the heart of the darkness. I am your captain, but this is not my ship. You have a voice. What do you say?" Arion looked at the skeleton, at the maps, then at the sealed doorway that led to the silent, waiting staircase. He thought of the man in the pit, of the triumphant, inhuman chant. He thought of the endless gray sea and the enraged face of the god who ruled it. He looked at Lykon, and in the captain's hard, guilt-ridden eyes, he saw not madness, but a flicker of something he hadn't seen since before the storm, the glint of a warrior's hope. "We fight," Arion said, his voice small but firm. "We don't run anymore." Kaelen let out a long, shuddering sigh, the sound of a man defeated. He slumped against the wall, his head in his hands. He did not agree, but he would not abandon them. The decision was made. Following the map, they found the spot, a section of wall in the main passage, 100 paces past the study. Anaximander had etched a tiny, almost invisible star into the stone. There was no hidden mechanism here. This was a point of no return, a choice that required force. Using the sharpened boat hook and a heavy rock as a hammer, Lykon and Kaelen began the grueling work of breaking through. The stone of Anaximander's tunnel was hard, but it was just stone. After an hour of sweat-soaked, bone-jarring labor, a crack appeared. Then another. With a final, desperate heave, they dislodged a block, revealing a cavity behind it.
The air that flowed out was not stale and dry. It was damp, heavy, and carried the familiar, sickeningly sweet smell of copper. And with it, faint but undeniable, came the hum. They broke through enough blocks to make a hole they could squeeze through. Lykon went first, holding the lantern. He emerged not into a tunnel, but a cavern, a natural artery in the rock. The walls were not cut, but were a slick, dark reddish black, streaked with veins of glistening green copper ore. They were uneven and organic, and in the wavering lantern light, they seemed to pulse gently, like the lining of a great throat. The hum was stronger here, a constant, low thrum that vibrated up through the soles of their feet. "This is it," he called back, "one of the veins." Arion squeezed through next, followed by Kaelen, who had to force his broad shoulders through the gap.
They stood together in the narrow, winding cavern, a small pocket of light and warmth in a vast, alien anatomy. Anaximander's passage was a clean, straight line of human reason. This was the island's messy, living interior. They followed the vein, consulting the clay map at every turn. The path twisted and sloped downwards, leading them deeper into the mountain. The hum grew steadily louder, the single note fracturing into a complex and discordant symphony. It was no longer just a sound, but a presence, a malevolent intelligence pressing in on them. And it began to whisper. Not in words, but in memories. It sifted through their minds, seeking the cracks in their resolve, the fears that festered in the dark. For Kaelen, it was the faces of the crew of the Triton's daughter, their eyes wide and drowning, their silent mouths forming his name, accusing him. He saw the sacrificed sailor, his head thrown back, not in pain, but in ecstasy, a beatific smile on his face as the black knife descended. He stumbled, his hand going to his head. "So peaceful," he murmured. He was at peace. "He was murdered, Kaelen," Lykon snapped, grabbing his arm and shaking him. "It's a lie. The island is showing you what you want to see. Fight it." For Arion, it was the water. He felt the crushing pressure of the depths, the searing pain of salt water in his lungs. He saw the leering, barnacle-encrusted face of the Triton warrior rising before him, its bronze spear leveled at his chest. He cried out, stumbling backward, his hands held up to ward off the phantom. Lykon pulled the boy close. "It's not real, Arion. It's an echo, a bad dream. Look at me. Look at the lights." But the island saved its most venomous assault for Lykon. It did not show him the dead. It showed him the living. He heard the booming, arrogant voice of King Agamedes, not from a memory, but as if the man were walking beside him in the dark. "A navy greater than the sea gods," the voice chuckled, dripping with contempt. "And you believed me, little captain. You were so proud of your new ship, the flagship of a fleet built on sand. You are the true fool, Lykon. You led them all to their deaths for my vanity." Lykon gritted his teeth, his knuckles white on the lantern's handle. He kept walking, his steps heavy. "You should have stayed a fisherman," the voice continued, worming its way past his defenses. "You are no leader. You left that man in the pit. You lead this old man and this boy to their graves. You are a butcher, not a captain. You are nothing." "I am the man who will shut your mouth forever," Lykon snarled into the darkness. He stopped, forcing Kaelen and Arion to look at him. The lantern light illuminated the sweat on his brow, the wildness in his eyes. "Listen to me. It's a trick, a coward's weapon. It uses our own minds against us. Don't listen to the ghosts. Listen to my voice. Listen to the sound of your own feet on the stone. That is what is real. The rest is poison." He tapped his own chest. "This is real." He tapped Arion's shoulder. "This is real." He looked Kaelen in the eye. "We are real. The island, it is just a hungry rock. We will not be its meal." His certainty was an anchor in the psychic storm. Kaelen shook his head as if to clear it, the dazed look in his eyes receding. Arion wiped tears from his face and nodded, his small hand gripping the back of Lykon's belt.
They pressed on, the hum now a deafening, soul-shaking drone. The air grew thick and sharp with the smell of ozone, the scent of a lightning strike just moments after it hits. The walls of the cavern began to glow with a faint, pulsing phosphorescence, and the copper veins running through them seemed to shimmer with a captured energy. They turned a final sharp corner, and the cavern opened into a larger chamber. This was not the work of the island. The chamber was round, its walls smoothed and carved with geometric patterns that seemed to vibrate with the hum. It was ancient, far older than Anaximander's tower, built by a people who did not fear the island's heart, but who revered it. In the center of the chamber, on a raised dais of black, glassy rock, it rested. The Kephalos. It was not a large stone, no bigger than a man's head, but it commanded the entire chamber. It was a perfect, uncut crystal of a kind none of them had ever seen. It was not transparent, but held a swirling, milky storm within its depths.
Tiny, internal flashes of blue-white light, like silent lightning, arced and sparked within its core, illuminating it from within. It was not just holding the storm, it was the storm, a piece of primal cosmic fury, tamed and held in crystalline stillness. It was the source of the ozone smell, and the hum seemed to flow into it and out of it, as if it were the resonating heart of the entire island. They stood at the entrance to the chamber, mesmerized and terrified. The stone was beautiful, and it was the most dreadful thing they had ever seen. It pulsed with a power that made Poseidon's rage feel like a child's tantrum. Anaximander's weapon, Lykon breathed, taking a hesitant step forward. As he did, the hum changed. It rose in pitch, from a drone to a piercing, defensive shriek. And from the shadows at the far side of the chamber, a new sound answered it. The slow, deliberate slithering of a great weight being dragged across stone. They were not alone. The stone had a guardian. From the deepest shadows of the circular chamber, a head emerged, not of flesh and scale, but of articulated basalt and glowing copper ore. It was followed by a body of immense length and girth, a great serpent forged in the planet's heart. Its scales were interlocking plates of the same reddish-black rock as the cavern walls, grinding against each other with a sound like a shifting fault line. Veins of raw, green-glowing copper pulsed with the island's hum, tracing intricate patterns along its form. It had no eyes, only smooth, polished spheres of obsidian set into its massive head, reflecting the lantern light as two dead black voids. It was the island's antibody, the physical manifestation of its will. Kaelen made a choked, strangled sound and took an involuntary step back, his hand instinctively reaching for the hole they had made in the wall. Escape. It was the only thought his terror-stricken mind could form. But Lykon stood his ground, his grip on the lantern so tight his knuckles were white. He did not see a monster, he saw a mechanism, a lock, and the Kephalos was the key. The great stone serpent uncoiled slowly, its obsidian pseudo-eyes sweeping the chamber. It was blind, Lykon realized with a surge of desperate hope. It hunted by sound, by vibration. The hum was its sight, the tremors of their feet its language. It raised its head, its jaw unhinging to reveal not teeth, but rows of sharp crystalline shards, like quartz, that glittered in the light. It tasted the air, sensing their foreign warmth, their frantic heartbeats that were a discordant rhythm against the island's steady thrum. "Don't move," Lykon whispered, the words barely audible over the now deafening hum. "Don't even breathe." The serpent remained still, a statue of living rock, its head swaying slightly. The psychic assault intensified, no longer a whisper but a roar. The chamber itself seemed to press in, the very air thick with malevolence. Lykon felt a wave of crushing despair wash over him, a desire to simply lie down on the cold stone and let the peace of consumption take him. It was a sweet, seductive feeling, the promise of an end to struggle. He saw Arion's face go slack, his eyes glazing over. He saw Kaelen's shoulders slump in resignation. He fought it. He dredged up the image of the man in the pit, the feeling of his own failure, the burning shame of his flight.
He weaponized his guilt, honing it into a sharp point of defiance. No, he gritted out, the word of physical effort. He nudged Arion with his foot, a sharp, grounding contact. Stay with me. The boy blinked, a flicker of awareness returning to his eyes. Lykon knew they could not wait. The island was wearing them down, eroding their will to live. They had to act now while they still could. He met Kaelen's terrified gaze in the lantern light and made a series of quick, sharp gestures. He pointed to a far wall of the chamber, then to a loose rock at Kaelen's feet. He pointed to himself, then to the dais. The plan was simple, suicidal, and their only hope. A distraction. Kaelen understood. He gave a single, slow nod, his face a mask of grim acceptance. He was a sailor who had followed his captain into a storm, and he would follow him into the grave if he had to. He bent with agonizing slowness, his muscles screaming with the effort of control, and picked up a stone the size of his fist. Lykon held up 3 fingers, then lowered them one by one. On 0, Kaelen drew his arm back and hurled the rock with all the strength he possessed. The stone flew across the chamber, a tiny missile in the vast dark space, and struck the far wall with a sharp crack. The reaction was instantaneous. The serpent moved with a speed that defied its geological nature. It was not a slither, but an explosion of motion, a seismic event. It crossed the chamber in a heartbeat, its massive head striking the point of impact with the force of a battering ram. The wall fractured, stone dust exploding into the air. The sound of the impact was a deafening boom that echoed in the confined space, a sound of pure, indiscriminate violence. Now, Lykon yelled, the voice swallowed by the echoes. He ran. He sprinted from the relative safety of the tunnel entrance, across the open floor of the chamber, toward the glowing dais. Every footstep was a thunderclap on the stone floor, a beacon announcing his position. The hum focused on him, a psychic lance aimed directly at his soul.
The voice of King Agamedes was a bellow in his ears. "See how your men die for you, little captain. First your crew, now this old fool. You send them to their deaths while you chase glory." He saw the Triton's daughter not sinking, but burning, the flames a brilliant orange against the gray storm, and he could hear the screams of the men trapped below deck. He felt the heat on his face, smelled the charring wood and burning pitch. "It is not real," he roared, to himself, to the island, to the ghosts. The serpent, realizing its mistake, recoiled from the wall, its great body twisted, its obsidian eyes, though blind, turning with an unnerving accuracy toward the new source of the sound. Lykon with halfway to the dais, he would not make it. "Captain!" Arion screamed. The boy, small and forgotten in the chaos, acted on pure instinct. He grabbed the only other thing he could find, the heavy boat hook, and scraped its metal tip against the stone floor, creating a high, grating shriek. The sound, sharp and piercing, cut through the low rumble of the serpent's rage. The creature's head snapped toward the new noise, its attention momentarily divided. It gave Lykon the second he needed. He launched himself at the dais, his hands outstretched. He didn't try to climb it, he threw himself onto it, his ribs cracking against the edge of the black rock with a jolt of searing pain. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, ignoring the fire in his chest. The Kephalos was right there, a swirling vortex of contained energy, pulsing with a light that seemed to come from another reality. The island threw everything it had at him. The despair was a physical weight, the voices a cacophony of his every failure, his every fear. He reached for the stone, and his hand stopped, hovering inches away. He saw his wife's face, her expression not of love, but of pity. "You were never strong enough," she whispered. He closed his eyes. "I am strong enough for this." He slammed his hand down on the Kephalos. The world vanished in a flash of white, silent lightning. It was not a physical shock, but a spiritual one. The hum, the voices, the despair, they were all annihilated in an instant by a wave of pure, clean, cosmic power.
He felt the storm inside the stone, not as rage, but as potential. He felt the spin of the stars, the heat of their birth, the cold of the void between them. He felt the awesome, beautiful, and utterly indifferent power that existed before the gods were even a dream. The power of creation trapped in a crystal cage. A single clear thought, not his own, but a memory embedded in the stone, echoed in his mind. It was the voice of Anaximander, a final, clear instruction. Not a hammer, a tuning fork, match the resonance, then break it. Lykon opened his eyes. The pain in his ribs was a distant thing. The cavern was no longer dark, but illuminated by a fierce blue-white light emanating from his hand, from the stone. His veins were traced with the same light, his arm a conduit for the storm. The serpent was no longer confused. Its head was swiveling back toward him, but it was different now. The obsidian spheres of its eyes were no longer blank. Deep within them, tiny sparks of the same blue-white light flickered. He was no longer invisible to it. By touching the Kephalos, he had lit a beacon in the dark. The guardian could now see him, not with sight, but with a direct perception of the power he now held. It lowered its head, its crystalline teeth grinding together, and for the first time, it issued a sound of its own, a low, resonant hiss that was the sound of a mountain preparing to fall.
The hiss was the sound of geology in motion, of immense pressure-seeking a vent. The serpent's body began to coil, the grinding of its basalt plates sending deep, jarring vibrations through the floor. It was gathering itself for a strike. Lykon felt the raw, focused hatred of the island directed at him, a pressure that sought to crush his mind before the creature's body crushed his bones. The thought was a lifeline in the storm of psychic noise. Lykon forced himself to ignore the colossal stone beast preparing to kill him. He ignored the frantic, terrified gasps of Kaelen and Arion near the tunnel entrance. He closed his eyes, plunging himself into a world defined not by light, but by the power thrumming in his hand. He held the Kephalos, but he did not grip it. He let his hand rest upon it, becoming a receiver. He let the island's hum flow through the crystal, through his arm, into his very being. At first, it was chaos, the cacophony of a million hateful whispers. But beneath it all, there was a root note, a fundamental frequency. It was the deep, slow bass thrum he had felt since they first landed. The resonance of hunger, the island's core desire. And woven into it, a second, sharper frequency, a clean, piercing note of pure aggression. It was the serpent, a simple, uncomplicated song of violence, of guarding, of destroying that which was not part of the whole. It was the island's immune system, and he was the infection. The serpent struck. It did not lunge forward. The front third of its body uncoiled like a thrown spear. The sound was a shriek of displaced air and the roar of a rock slide. Lykon didn't see it. He felt the distortion in the island's hum. He threw himself sideways, rolling across the cold stone floor. The serpent's head smashed into the dais where he had been kneeling, cracking the glassy black rock with a percussive blast that sent shards flying through the chamber. Pain, white-hot and blinding, lanced up his side from his cracked ribs, but the Kephalos flared in his hand, and the pain receded into a dull, manageable ache. The power of the stone was sustaining him. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He had found the serpent's note. Now to match it. He focused not on the island's base hunger, but on that single sharp thread of aggression. He let the Kephalos become an amplifier, a mirror. He did not generate the note himself. He simply took what the serpent was broadcasting and reflected it back, purified and strengthened by the crystal. The blue-white light of the Kephalos shifted, its internal lightning storms calming into a steady, piercing glow that was the exact color of a winter star. The serpent, which had been drawing back for another strike, paused. Its great head tilted, a gesture of profound confusion. The obsidian spheres of its eyes, which had been locked on Lykon, now seemed to look inward.
It was hearing its own song, its own purpose, being sung back at it from an outside source. It was like a dog hearing a whistle pitched at a frequency only it could understand. "What is he doing?" Kaelen breathed, shrinking back against the tunnel wall. "He's talking to it," Arion whispered, his eyes wide with an awe that was beginning to conquer his fear. The serpent remained frozen for a long, silent moment. The psychic pressure in the room lessened. The island, through its guardian, was momentarily baffled. But it was an ancient, primal thing. Confusion quickly gave way to renewed rage. A foreign object was mimicking its voice. It was an intolerable mockery. The grinding of its scales resumed, louder this time, angrier. Lykon knew he had only one chance. He had its attention. He had matched its key. Now he had to introduce the dissonant chord that would shatter the harmony. What was the opposite of this clean, simple, geological violence? What was the one thing the island, with its desire for the peace of consumption, could not comprehend? Humanity. He opened the floodgates of his own soul, pouring every ounce of his chaotic, complex, and contradictory being into the stone. He poured in his grief for the men lost on the Triton's daughter, a grief so vast it felt like a second ocean. He poured in his rage, not the clean rage of the island, but the dirty, complicated rage of a man betrayed by his king and tormented by a petty god. He added his burning, suffocating guilt over the sailor left in the pit.
He poured in the memory of his wife's laughter, a sound of such impossible, fragile beauty that it was anathema in this place of stone and hunger. And last, fiercest of all, he poured in his love for the two souls huddled in the tunnel behind him, his desperate, paternal need to protect the boy, and his stubborn, begrudging loyalty to the old man. It was a chord of grief, rage, guilt, beauty, and love, a chord of utter, incomprehensible chaos. It was the song of being human. The Kephalos could not contain it. The steady blue-white light exploded. A wave of pure, soundless energy erupted from the stone. It was not a physical force, but a psychic one. It was the musical equivalent of a star going nova. The serpent convulsed. The copper veins running through its body flashed erratically, from green to a sickening yellow to a blinding white. The clean, sharp note of its resonance was shattered, overwhelmed by the cacophony Lykon had unleashed. It was a machine being fed 1,000 contradictory commands at once. The basalt plates of its body began to vibrate violently, not in unison, but against each other. A high, thin shriek filled the air, the sound of stone tearing itself apart under impossible stress. A crack appeared along the serpent's flank, then another. Its obsidian eyes shattered, revealing nothing but solid rock beneath. Its head whipped back and forth, smashing against the walls and floor in a final, mindless death throw. Then, with a final deep groan that seemed to rise from the bedrock itself, it collapsed. It did not fall over. It simply came apart, its structure undone. The great head crumbled into a pile of black rubble. The long body disintegrated into a mound of sharp-edged plates and copper-dusted stone. Silence. The oppressive hum of the island was gone. It had been so constant that its absence was a physical blow, a sudden hollowing out of the world. All that remained was the faint, clean hum of the Kephalos in Lykon's hand, now pulsing with a soft, gentle light, like a star after a storm. Lykon fell to his knees, the stone slipping from his grasp and clattering onto the dais. The light in his arm vanished. The exhaustion that hit him was absolute, a crushing weight that felt heavier than the mountain above. The pain in his ribs returned with a vengeance, and every breath was a fresh agony. The power had receded, leaving him empty, scoured out. Kaelen and Arion rushed to his side. "Lykon, Captain!" "I'm alive," Lykon rasped, pushing himself up into a sitting position against the dais. He looked at the pile of rubble that had been the guardian. "It's gone."
"You killed it," Arion said, his voice filled with reverence. "You killed a mountain." "I just showed it a mirror it didn't like," Lykon said, his head swimming. He looked at his hand. It was just a hand again, scarred, calloused, and trembling. He had held the power of a thunderbolt, and now he could barely make a fist. Kaelen helped him to his feet. The big sailor's face was pale, his eyes wide with the aftershock of what he had witnessed. The pragmatic, cynical man had seen something that defied all the known rules of the world. "The whispers, they're gone," he said, touching his head as if to be sure. "The air is clean." It was true. The chamber was just a chamber now. The malevolent presence had retreated, its local manifestation destroyed. But Lykon knew it was a temporary victory. "We haven't won," he said, his voice regaining some of its strength. "We broke a guard dog. The master of the house is still sleeping." He retrieved the Kephalos. It was cool to the touch now, its inner storm quiescent. But when he held it, he could feel its latent power, a sleeping titan. He gestured to the clay tablet with the map, which Arion had carefully brought with them. "Anaximander said the core is the heart. We struck its hand. Now we must strike its heart." He looked at the map, tracing the path from their chamber deeper into the island's veins. The path to the core was short, but it was marked on the diagram with jagged lines, like a warning of treacherous terrain. "The power, it took something from me," Lykon admitted, looking at his companions. "I don't know if I can use it like that again." "Then we will be your strength," Arion said, his voice unwavering. He picked up the boat hook, holding it like a spear. It was a child's gesture, but it was filled with a man's resolve.
Kaelen tore a strip of cloth from the hem of his ragged tunic and began to expertly bind Lykon's bruised ribs, his movements gentle and efficient. "The boy is right," the old sailor said, his voice rough with emotion. "We followed you into the dark, Captain. We'll follow you into the fire." Lykon looked at them, at the old man's steady hands and the boy's fierce eyes. His guilt had not vanished, but for the first time it was outweighed by something else, a captain's pride. He had broken his code to save them, and in doing so had forged a crew stronger than any he had ever commanded. "All right," he said, taking a deep breath against the binding on his ribs. "To the heart." He took the lead, holding the Kephalos in one hand and the lantern in the other. The stone cast a soft, forward-projecting glow, illuminating the tunnel that led away from the Guardian's chamber. The passage was different from the vein they had followed. It was narrower, and the walls were not slick, but jagged and crystalline, as if they were walking through a geode. The light from the Kephalos was different now. It no longer fought against an oppressive darkness, but filled a neutral void. It cast a clean, silver-blue glow that refracted through the crystalline walls of the new passage, shattering into 1,000 dancing shards of light on the jagged surfaces. The effect was both beautiful and deeply unnerving. It was like walking through the heart of a broken diamond. The air had changed too. The metallic tang and the psychic hum were gone, replaced by a profound, sterile silence, and the clean, cold scent of ozone, like the air after a winter thunderstorm. Every sound they made, the scrape of a boot, a rattling cough from Lykon, the soft clink of the boat hook against the wall, was unnaturally sharp, an intrusion on a silence that felt ancient and absolute. "Careful," Kaelen muttered, his voice a low rumble. "These walls look sharp enough to shave with." He ran a hand gently over a protruding crystal facet, its edges as perfect and unforgiving as cut glass. They moved slowly, Lykon leaning heavily on the old sailor. The binding around his ribs was a tight, reassuring pressure, but with every step, a lance of pain reminded him of his body's fragility. The power of the Kephalos had been a borrowed strength, and the debt was now coming due in aches and exhaustion. The stone itself felt different in his hand. The raging storm within was gone, replaced by a deep, rhythmic pulse, a slow and steady beat that he could feel humming up his arm. It was like holding a sleeping heart. "How far do you think it is?"
Arion asked, his voice small in the vast silence. He stayed close to Lykon, his eyes scanning the crystalline maze ahead. Lykon consulted the clay tablet, which Kaelen now carried tucked under one arm. The map is less clear here. Anaximander's lines become frantic. He was in a hurry. He pointed to the jagged markings. This path is not straight. It winds around something, but it's the only way. They walked for what felt like an hour, the passage narrowing and widening unpredictably. The disorienting reflections cast by the crystals began to play tricks on their eyes. Shadows seemed to move in their peripheral vision, and at times, the passage ahead seemed to split into 3 identical paths, forcing them to stop while Lykon held the Kephalos up, its steady, true light revealing the illusion and showing the single real way forward. It was in one of the wider sections that the island's influence began to seep back in. It was not the aggressive psychic assault of before. This was something far more insidious. A profound weariness began to settle over them, a lethargy that felt as heavy as a wet cloak. It was a sweet, gentle temptation, a soft whisper that didn't use words, but feelings. Rest. You have fought so hard. You have earned your peace. The stone here is so cool. Just for a moment, close your eyes. Arion was the first to falter. His steps slowed and his head began to droop. He stumbled, catching himself against a crystal wall. "I'm so tired, Captain," he mumbled, his eyelids fluttering. "Maybe we should stop, just for a little while." Lykon saw the glazed look in the boy's eyes and felt a spike of cold fear. This was the true nature of the island's hunger, not a violent consumption, but a slow, gentle lulling into stillness. It didn't devour, it absorbed. He grabbed Arion's shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong. "No, Arion, we don't stop. We never stop. Look at me." He brought the Kephalos close to the boy's face. The stone's clean light seemed to push back the fog in Arion's eyes. "That feeling is a lie," Lykon said, his voice hard. "It is the enemy. You fight it by moving, one foot, then the other. That is all that matters." Even as he spoke, he felt the pull himself. His own eyelids felt like lead weights. The pain in his ribs was a distant, nagging thing, and the thought of simply lying down on the crystalline floor and letting the silence take him was a temptation of exquisite power. He saw Kaelen leaning heavily against a wall, his breathing slow and deep, his eyes half closed. "Kaelen," Lykon barked, "talk to me. Tell me about the first ship you ever served on." The Sea Lark," he said, his voice thick with sleep. "A fishing skiff out of Astakos, leaked like a sieve. The captain was with a, he trailed off, his head lolling. "With a what, Kaelen? What did he have?"
Lykon pressed, moving to stand in front of him, blocking his path. "A glass eye," Kaelen finished, a flicker of memory animating his face. "Said he lost his real one in a fight with a squid. We all knew he'd sold it for wine." A small, dry chuckle escaped his lips. The act of remembering, of telling the story, seemed to push the lethargy back. "Keep talking," Lykon commanded. "Arion, you tell us about your mother's garden. What did she grow?" They forced themselves onward, their progress now marked by a chain of stories, of memories dragged out into the sterile air as a shield against the creeping peace. They spoke of bustling markets, of the taste of sun-warmed figs, of the chaos of their homes, and the familiar ache of hard work. They filled the silent, crystalline passage with the messy, vibrant, and complicated noise of human life, and for a time, it was enough. The passage ended abruptly. It opened onto a narrow ledge, no wider than a ship's plank, that skirted the edge of an immense vertical chasm. The abyss was utterly black, swallowing the light from their lantern and even the glow of the Kephalos. There was no hint of a bottom. The air that rose from it was warmer, and it carried a new sound, a slow, deep, rhythmic pulse. Thump, thump, thump. It was the source of the vibration in the Kephalos, the heartbeat of the island. They had almost reached the core. The ledge continued for about 50 paces, but then it stopped. A section of the walkway, 20 feet long, had sheared away from the cliff face, leaving a gaping void. On the far side, the ledge resumed, leading to a dark opening in the rock.
And there, scattered on the stone of the far ledge, was the proof that they were not the first to face this. A bronze chisel, a wooden mallet, its head split, a coil of rotted rope. Anaximander, Kaelen breathed, staring across the gap. He tried to bridge it or cut a new path, and he failed. The realization fell upon them with the weight of a death sentence. The philosopher, with all his reason and engineering skill, had been defeated right here. The island had not allowed him to pass. It had broken his path, and he had been forced to retreat, returning to his study to record his failure and die. They were trapped. The soporific influence of the core was stronger here, at the edge of the chasm, the pulsing heartbeat a constant hypnotic lullaby. Turning back meant a long, arduous journey through the crystalline maze, fighting the desire to sleep with every step. Moving forward was impossible. Lykon stared at the gap, his mind refusing to accept defeat. His gaze fell on the massive, jagged crystals that studded the cliff face above the broken ledge. Some of them were immense, thick as a man's torso and jutting out 10 or 15 feet from the wall. They were a forest of giant, immovable spears hanging over the abyss. An idea, born of desperation and the lingering memory of the power he held, began to form. He looked at the Kephalos, then back at the largest of the crystals, a colossal shard of quartz-like material directly above the chasm. "The boat hook," he said, his voice tight with a terrifying new resolve. "Arion, give it to me. Kaelen, I need you to anchor me." "What are you thinking?" Kaelen asked, his eyes wide with alarm. "You can't jump that. No one could." "I'm not going to jump," Lykon said. He held up the Kephalos. Its internal light pulsed in time with the heartbeat from the chasm. He tried to fight the island with bronze and wood. He treated it like a problem of engineering. He looked at Kaelen, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "But it's not just a rock. It's alive. It has a voice. It has a harmony." He tapped the crystal hanging over the abyss. "And so does this." He handed the lantern and the tablet to Arion. He took the boat hook and gave the coil of sailcloth rope they carried to Kaelen. "Tie one end around my waist, tie the other around your own, and do not let go, no matter what you hear." His plan was madness, a gamble based on a half-understood mystical experience. He was going to try to do to the great crystal what he had done to the serpent, find its resonance. Not to shatter it, but to move it, to command it, to make the stone itself form their bridge.
Kaelen's hands, callous from a lifetime of hauling nets and rigging, felt clumsy and thick as he knotted the rope around Lykon's waist. The familiar weave of the hemp was the only sane thing in a world of impossible crystal and soul-stealing whispers. He pulled the knot tight, a double bowline that would hold a ship's mast in a gale, and then began to secure the other end around his own thick torso, looping it twice for good measure. "This is madness," he whispered, not to Lykon, but to the abyss, as if the darkness might talk some sense into him. "The rock will fall and take you with it. It will take us all." "Then it will be a quick death," Lykon replied, his voice strained. He stood at the very precipice, the toe of his boot inches from the drop. He held the boat hook in one hand, its metal tip resting on the stone, a grounding point. In the other, he cradled the Kephalos against his chest. "But if we do nothing, it will be a slow one. I prefer my odds." He looked back at Arion, who stood clutching the lantern, his face a pale, luminous moon in the darkness. "If the rope goes taut, don't look down. Look at the other side, and get ready to pull." The boy nodded, his jaw set with a grim determination that was far too old for his face. Lykon turned back to the chasm. He took a deep, shuddering breath that sent a fresh wave of fire through his ribs, and then he closed his eyes. He let the world of sight fall away. He let the hypnotic thump, thump of the island's heart become the rhythm of his own blood. He was not a man on a ledge anymore. He was a blind listener in a silent concert hall. He raised the Kephalos, holding it out over the void. First, he listened for the crystal.
Its resonance was nothing like the serpent's. Where the guardian had been a sharp, angry note of violence, the great crystal was a chord of immense, patient, and profound stillness. It was the sound of 1 billion years of geological pressure, of slow formation in the dark, of being perfectly and immovably itself. It was the music of stasis. Match the resonance. He let the island's heartbeat flow through him and into the Kephalos, but he filtered it, dampened it, until only the purest, quietest part of its energy remained. The stone in his hand warmed, and its soft blue light began to intensify, shifting its hue, striving to find the exact crystalline frequency of the great shard hanging over the abyss. The psychic lethargy surged, a wave of warm, thick honey trying to pour into his mind. It is so peaceful. The song of the stone. Why would you disturb it? Join the song. Be still. Forever. A trickle of warm blood ran from his nose, a single dark line down his lip. He tasted the salt and copper of it, and the tang of his own life force being spent was a sharp, welcome shock that cut through the encroaching torpor. He focused harder, pushing his own consciousness into the Kephalos, using his will as a fine-tuning instrument. The light from the stone shifted again, a final, minute adjustment, and then it locked. A low hum began to fill the air, a perfect harmonic overtone to the island's heartbeat. It was a pure, resonant tone that vibrated in their bones. The Kephalos and the great crystal were now singing the same note. They were in sympathy. Gods below, Kaelen breathed, feeling the vibration through the soles of his boots. He braced his feet, his knuckles white where he gripped the rope. Now came the impossible part. Break it. Not with chaos, but with intent. He had to introduce a new idea into that perfect billion-year-old song of stillness. He had to teach the stone the concept of purpose. He didn't pour his emotions into the Kephalos this time. He poured in a single, unadorned, and desperately sharp thought. A vision of the ledge on the other side. He thought of a bridge. He thought of the three of them, a broken captain, a weary sailor, a determined boy, walking across the gap. He focused all of his remaining strength, all of his will to survive, into that one simple, impossible command. Move. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. The hum continued, pure and unchanging. The island's influence redoubled its efforts, whispering that his attempt was futile, that a man's will was a fleeting spark against the eternity of the stone. His vision began to gray at the edges. The sound of the heartbeat grew louder, drowning out his thoughts. He was failing. Then, a new sound. A high, thin whine, like stressed metal.
A cloud of fine, crystalline dust sifted down from the great shard. The hum wavered. It was a jarring, discordant sound, like a lyre string being bent out of tune. The great crystal shuddered, a tremor that ran from its base in the cliff face to its tip. A deep, groaning crack echoed across the chasm. "It's breaking!" Arion shouted, his voice sharp with panic. "Hold on!" Lykon roared, though the words were a raw tear in his throat. He pushed harder, his mind a battering ram against the crystal's inertia. Blood now flowed freely from his nose, and a fierce, hammering pressure built behind his eyes. The crystal did not fall. With a sound like a glacier calving, a screech of shearing stone that set their teeth on edge, its fundamental nature began to change. It did not move as one solid piece. Instead, its tip began to grow. Faceted, smaller crystals, identical to the main one, began to extrude from its point, budding and branching in a silent, terrifyingly fast process. They reached across the void, knitting themselves together in mid-air, bathed in the unearthly blue light of the Kephalos. It was a bridge of pure crystal, jagged and uneven, being woven from nothingness before their eyes. It reached the far ledge with a solid thump that vibrated back to them. The growth stopped. A narrow, treacherous walkway, no wider than a man's shoulders and slick with crystalline frost, now spanned the chasm.
The hum ceased, the Kephalos dimmed to a faint glow. Lykon staggered back from the edge, the strength going out of his legs. The world swam in a gray haze. "Go!" he gasped, his hand still clamped on the boat hook to keep from falling. "Across, now, before it—" He didn't need to finish. Kaelen was already moving, half pulling, half carrying him onto the crystalline span. The bridge was shockingly cold under their feet, and it felt unnervingly alive, vibrating with a faint, residual energy. Arion followed close behind, his eyes fixed on the far side, the lantern held high. They were halfway across when a deep, resonant crack echoed from the cliff face. A web of fractures appeared at the base of the great crystal. Lykon's influence was fading. The island was reasserting its nature, and its nature was stasis, not structure. "Faster!" Kaelen grunted, his fear giving him a surge of strength. He all but threw Lykon the last 10 feet, the captain landing in a heap on the solid rock of the far ledge. Kaelen scrambled after him, turning just in time to see Arion leap the last few feet. Behind them, with a final, agonized groan of parting stone, the crystalline bridge disintegrated. It did not fall into the chasm, it simply dissolved into a shower of glittering silver-blue dust that was swallowed by the darkness below. A moment later, the great crystal itself, its structure compromised, broke free from the wall and plunged silently into the abyss, leaving a raw, fresh scar in the rock. They lay panting on the cold stone, the chasm once again impassable. There was no retreat. In front of them was the dark opening Anaximander had never reached. The air flowing from it was thick and warm, and the slow, deep heartbeat of the island was no longer a distant sound. It was here. It was waiting. Kaelen untied the rope, his hands shaking. He looked at Lykon, who was pale as death, a smear of blood under his nose, his breathing shallow. He had done the impossible, but the cost was etched on his face. "Never," Kaelen said, his voice hoarse with awe and terror. "In all my years, I have never seen such a thing." Lykon pushed himself into a sitting position, his back against a cold rock. He held up the Kephalos. It was almost dark now, its internal light a mere ember. "It's fading," he whispered. "Or I am. I don't know if there's enough power left for what comes next." He looked into the tunnel. It was not long. He could see the end of it, perhaps only 100 paces away. It opened into a vast, round cavern illuminated by a soft, internal, blood-red light. In the center of that cavern, suspended in the air by what looked like thick, dark, pulsating roots that grew from the floor and ceiling, was the core. It was a sphere of living, crystalline rock, 20 feet in diameter, and with every deep thump, a wave of crimson light pulsed through its semi-translucent depths. This was no hungry rock, this was an egg, or a heart. And Anaximander had been wrong about one thing. It was not sleeping, it was waking up.
The ember in the Kephalos pulsed weakly, a tiny spark of cosmic blue against the overwhelming, visceral crimson that bled from the cavern ahead. Lykon clutched the stone, its coolness a stark contrast to the feverish heat radiating from his own body. He felt hollowed out, as if the act of commanding the crystal bridge had scooped out not just his strength, but some essential part of his spirit. "Captain?" Arion's voice was a tremulous whisper. He had taken the lantern back from Lykon, and its familiar yellow flame seemed a fragile, pathetic thing in this alien place. Kaelen got to his feet, his broad frame a solid silhouette against the mouth of the tunnel. He looked from Lykon's blood-streaked face to the pulsating chamber, and for the first time since the storm, the old sailor looked truly lost. The world of ropes, tides, and winds was a distant memory. This was a place of gods and monsters, and he was just a man with aching bones. "There is no other way," Lykon rasped, forcing himself to stand. He swayed, and Kaelen's arms shot out, steadying him. The simple, solid contact was an anchor. "Thank you. Save your thanks for the other side of this," Kaelen gurgled, though his grip remained firm. If there is one. Together, the three of them moved forward, a single, stumbling unit, and entered the final tunnel. The warmth became a stifling, humid heat.
The air was thick and tasted of salt and something else, something metallic and organic, like fresh blood. The heartbeat was no longer a sound they heard with their ears, but a pressure wave that pulsed through their bodies, vibrating deep in their chests, trying to force their own hearts into its slow, inexorable rhythm. They emerged onto the floor of the great cavern. It was a perfect dome, far larger than it had appeared from the ledge. The floor was smooth, like polished bone, and sloped gently downwards toward the center. Above, the ceiling was a web of the thick, black root-like veins, all converging on the colossal, suspended heart, the core. It was more beautiful and more terrible than Lykon could have imagined. Its crystalline surface was not smooth but faceted, and with every crimson pulse, the light within would catch on these facets, shifting and refracting, revealing glimpses of a complex, lattice-like structure deep inside. It was an organ and a jewel, a womb and a tomb. The veins that held it were not static. They twitched and throbbed in time with the beat, their dark surfaces glistening as if slick with oil. And they were not alone. From the curving walls at the edge of the cavern, figures were emerging. They did not walk out of tunnels, but seemed to step directly out of the solid rock, coalescing from the shadows like beads of moisture on a cold stone. There were dozens of them. Sailors in the ragged, brine-stiffened tunics of a dozen different eras. Island fishermen with nets still draped over their shoulders. Warriors with corroded bronze helmets and splintered spears. Men and women, young and old, all of them preserved in the state they had been in when the island took them. The shepherds. Their eyes were open but saw nothing. Their faces were slack, devoid of thought or emotion. They moved with a slow, synchronized shuffling gait, their bare feet making no sound on the bone-like floor. They were a congregation of the lost, a choir of the consumed, and they were all moving toward the core. The others, Kaelen breathed, his voice cracking. All the ships, all the crews. He scanned the faces, his eyes wide with a dawning horror, as if searching for men he might have known. The shepherds paid them no mind. They were deaf and blind to the living, their entire beings focused on the summons of the heart. As they drew closer to the center, they began to hum, a low, guttural, multi-toned drone that was the sound of 100 empty throats being used as instruments. It was the same chant they had heard from the tit, but magnified, a chorus of oblivion. "It's not waking up," Lykon said, his mind seizing on the terrible truth with a sudden chilling clarity. "It's feeding, or preparing to be born. It's drawing all of its parts back to itself." He watched as the first of the shepherds reached the space directly beneath the core. The figure stopped, its head tilted back, and its mouth opened impossibly wide. A thin, shimmering tendril of reddish light descended from the heart and touched the man's lips. The shepherd did not scream. His body simply dissolved. He deflated, his form turning into a stream of dull red motes that flowed up the tendril of light and were absorbed into the pulsating sphere. The clothes and the corroded helmet clattered empty onto the floor. One by one, the shepherds were being unmade, their stolen life force returned to the source to fuel its final metamorphosis. The core's pulse quickened, the crimson light brightened, and the psychic pressure, no longer a gentle lethargy, but a powerful, commanding summons, washed over them. Join, return, be complete. Kaelen grunted and shook his head, planting his feet as if resisting a physical wave. Arion cried out, his hands flying to his temples. Lykon felt it as a hook in his soul, a deep primal yearning to stop fighting, to walk forward and let the red light unburden him of his guilt and his pain. He fought back, his own will a flickering candle against the furnace. He looked down at the Kephalos. The blue ember was almost gone. It was a dying star. He thought of Anaximander's third tablet, the diagram of the resonance device. A counter-resonance, a dissonant chord. He hadn't just shattered the serpent with chaos, he had opposed its simple, violent song with the complex, messy chord of his own humanity. And here, the core's song was one of unity, of consumption, of a final, silent peace. It was a single, all-encompassing note. To break it, he needed a chord it could not resolve, a chord it could not absorb. "I can't do it alone," he said, his voice ragged. He turned to his crew. He saw the terror in Kaelen's eyes, the pain on Arion's face. But beneath it, he saw the same stubborn sparks of life that had gotten them this far. "The stone is almost spent. The power that moved the bridge, it came from me, and I don't have enough left." "Then we're dead," Kaelen stated flatly, his gaze fixed on another shepherd dissolving into light. "No," Lykon said, grabbing the old sailor's arm. "A chord is not one note, it is many. I am one note, you are another." He held up the Kephalos between them. "This is the lyre, but we must be the strings." Kaelen stared at him, his expression a mixture of disbelief and desperation. "You're mad. What are you asking? That we sing it to death?" "I am asking you to give me something to fight with," Lykon explained, his words coming in a rush as the core's pulse beat faster and faster. "The island sings of peace and blissful ending. I need you to sing of struggle, of life. Kaelen, all your years, all your bitterness, your refusal to break, your sheer stubborn will to see another sunrise. I need that. I need you to pour all of that defiance into this stone. No memories, no grief, just the pure, hard anger of a man who will not die quietly." He then knelt before Arion, his movements stiff with pain. He put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Arion, you are not a cynic like him, or a broken man like me. You have seen horror, but it hasn't put out your light. I need what you still have, hope, not just for survival, but for what comes after. The thought of your home, the taste of your mother's bread, the feeling of the sun on your face. I need you to pour that belief, that dream of a future, into this stone." He stood, looking between the old man and the young boy. "It wants to absorb us, so we will give it a meal that will poison it from the inside out. Defiance, hope, and..." He paused, his own role in this terrible orchestra becoming clear. "And sacrifice." He placed their hands on the Kephalos, one on each side. He put his own hand over theirs, covering the last remaining glimmer of blue light. The stone was a focal point, a lens for their souls. "Now," he commanded, his voice ringing with the last of his authority. "Focus, give it to me." He closed his eyes and led them, reaching into himself, past the pain and the guilt, to the cold, hard kernel of his decision. He offered the island his acceptance, his willingness to die here, to let his own life be the final discordant note that would shatter the symphony of consumption. He did not fight the summons, he embraced it on his own terms. It was the captain's ultimate duty to lay down his life for his crew. Kaelen clenched his jaw, his eyes screwing shut. He dredged up every slight, every storm, every cheating merchant and cruel taskmaster. He summoned the memory of the cold, the hunger, the unending, grinding labor of a life at sea.
He focused it all into a single sharp point of pure, undiluted refusal. No! A lifetime of endurance became a weapon. Arion, tears streaming down his face, did as he was told. He forced the images of horror away and thought of the small garden behind his house, the smell of the sea on a clear day, the warmth of his dog sleeping at the foot of his bed. He thought not of escape, but of return. He poured a stream of pure, desperate, and beautiful longing into the crystal. 3 notes. The bitter, unyielding will to live. The bright, untarnished hope for a future. The final, solemn acceptance of death. It was the chord of humanity. The Kephalos flared. It did not shine with the clean, cosmic blue of before. It erupted in a chaotic, blinding swirl of color. A furious, defiant red from Kaelen. A brilliant, sun yellow from Arion. And from Lykon, a deep, silent, star-flecked violet. The colors twisted together, a violent vortex of light in his hand. The core reacted. Its rhythmic, crimson pulse faltered.
The monolithic crimson pulse shattered into a frantic, arrhythmic spasm. The great heart in the center of the cavern recoiled, its light flickering like a guttering flame, shifting from blood red to a bruised, sickly purple. The commanding psychic summons became a piercing, silent scream of agony and outrage. It was the sound of a god getting a fishbone caught in its throat. The universe had a single, simple song, and they had just introduced a measure of music it could not comprehend. The feedback was instantaneous and brutal. A psychic shockwave radiated back through the Kephalos, slamming into the three of them. For Kaelen, it was the crushing weight of 1,000 drownings. He felt the collective despair of every soul the island had ever consumed, a tidal wave of hopelessness that sought to extinguish his small, flickering ember of defiance. He saw his own body, old and broken, sinking into a black, silent abyss, and for a moment, he welcomed it. The peace was so seductive. But then, deep within him, the stubborn, irrational core of his being, the part of him that had survived 100 storms and 1,000 injustices, roared, "No." He gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw standing out like cords of rope, and pushed back, his own bitterness a shield against the abyss. Arion screamed, a thin, sharp sound of pure terror. The island took his hope and showed him its inversion. He saw his home, but it was empty, the garden choked with weeds, the door hanging open on a dark and silent house. He tasted his mother's bread, but it was full of ash and tasted of grief. He felt the sun on his face, but it was a cold, dying star in a black sky. Every beautiful thing he had offered was being systematically murdered before his mind's eye. The yellow light in the Kephalos flickered wildly, threatening to go out. But it was Lykon who bore the true storm. As the anchor and the intended sacrifice, he stood at the epicenter of the conflict. The core's pain and confusion poured into him, a torrent of alien consciousness. He felt its billion-year slumber, its slow, cold, geological thoughts. He felt its hunger, not as malice, but as a simple, cosmic imperative, like gravity. And he felt its utter, terrifying bewilderment at the chord they had created. It was like trying to explain color to a creature that had only ever known gray. The violet light of his sacrifice deepened, and he felt his own life force being drawn out, not by the core's hunger, but as fuel for the dissonant chord itself. His physical body was becoming the price of the song. "Hold on!" He forced the words past his teeth, blood now trickling from the corners of his mouth. "Arion, it's a lie! Don't look at it! Think of us, right here, right now!" The boy, hearing his captain's voice cut through the nightmare, squeezed his eyes shut. He stopped thinking of home. He thought of Kaelen's rough hand on his shoulder, of Lykon's fierce, desperate eyes. He thought of their insane, impossible journey through the dark. His hope was no longer for a distant future, but for the next heartbeat, for the survival of the men whose hands were clasped with his over the glowing stone. The yellow light steadied, burning with a new, fiercer intensity. The cavern itself was coming apart. The great, throbbing veins that held the core aloft began to writhe and spasm. One of them, thick as an ancient oak, tore loose from the ceiling with a wet, ripping sound, showering the floor with black ichor and rock dust. The core sagged, its rhythm skipping another beat. The polished bone floor cracked under their feet, fissures spreading out from the center of the room like a spider's web. The remaining shepherds, their connection to the master consciousness severed by the psychic static, simply froze. For a moment, they were just statues, and then, with a sound like dry leaves crumbling, they disintegrated into piles of gray dust and tarnished metal. The core fought back. It could not understand their chord, so it tried to break it apart. It focused its remaining power on what it perceived as the weakest note, Orion's hope. The psychic assault on the boy intensified tenfold. He cried out again, his small body trembling.
Kaelen, Lykon yelled, his own vision starting to tunnel into darkness. Protect him. Your note is the strongest. Shield him with it. The old sailor didn't hesitate.
He shifted his stance, planting himself slightly in front of Arion, a human bulwark against the invisible tide. He let go of his own battle against the abyss and instead focused his raw, unyielding defiance outward, projecting it like a wall around the boy. He wasn't just refusing to die, he was refusing to let the boy's light be extinguished. The furious red of his will flared in the Kephalos, enveloping and steadying Arion's flickering yellow. It was the act of a man who had nothing left to believe in, fiercely protecting the belief of another. The cord held, twisted, strained, but unbroken. Lykon knew this was a stalemate they could not win. He could feel his own life slipping away, the violet light in the stone becoming deeper, more absolute. They were holding the beast at bay, but it was still alive, and they were dying. The Kephalos was a tuning fork, but you don't defeat a drum by humming at it. You have to strike it. "We have to move," he gasped, his legs trembling with the effort of standing. "We have to touch it." "Touch that thing?" Kaelen snarled, his face beaded with sweat. "It will unmake us." "It's unmaking me already," Lykon countered. "The song isn't enough. We have to deliver the poison directly to its heart." He took a step. It was like wading through setting concrete. The psychic pressure was a physical force, pushing him back, commanding him to be still. He leaned into it, his muscles screaming. His vision was a swirling vortex of violet and crimson. He could feel Kaelen and Arion stumble forward with him, tethered by their shared grip on the stone. Another step. A fissure cracked open inches from his foot, venting a cloud of hot, foul-smelling steam. The core's heartbeat was a frantic, terrified drum solo now, the cavern filled with its panic. It knew what he intended. They were a three-headed creature, a trinity of defiance, hope, and sacrifice, shambling across the floor of a dying god's inner sanctum. Every foot of progress cost them dearly. Kaelen was groaning, a low, continuous sound of pure effort. Arion was weeping silently, his face a mask of agony, but his grip on the stone was unbreakable. Lykon felt a strange, cold clarity descend upon him. The pain was distant now, the fear a memory. He knew with absolute certainty that he would not walk back out of this cavern. The sacrifice he had offered was not a metaphor. The Kephalos was draining the last of his life to power this final, impossible act. His violet note was the sound of his own end, and it was the sharpest, purest part of their dissonant chord. They were 20 feet away. The heat from the core was a physical blow, its light so intense it burned even through their closed eyelids. The air crackled with raw, uncontrolled power. Another of the great veins snapped, and the heart lurched violently, dropping several feet until it was barely hovering above the cavern floor. Its beautiful, crystalline surface was now webbed with black cracks, the crimson light within pulsing erratically, like a failing electrical system. "Almost there," Lykon whispered, the words barely audible over the roaring in his own head. He could see it now, his final destination. He was no longer a captain trying to save his crew. He was a weapon, aimed and fired. And Kaelen and Arion were the fletching that kept his aim true. He lifted the Kephalos, the swirling vortex of red, yellow, and violet light, a stark, living insult to the dying crimson of the core. He gathered the last dregs of his strength, ready for the final, desperate lunge. He was going to ram the heart of their humanity into the heart of the monster. With a guttural roar that was equal parts agony and effort, Lykon lunged. It was not the explosive movement of a healthy warrior, but the slow, grinding lunge of a man pushing a mountain.
He was the tip of the spear, with Kaelen's raw power at his back and Arion's desperate faith lending him impossible balance. They moved as one, a three-souled creature of pure intent, stumbling across the last few feet of cracking, heaving stone. The core unleashed its final defense. It did not attack their bodies, but the bonds between them. A wave of pure, distilled selfishness washed over Kaelen, a vision of him alone on the boat, sailing free, leaving the captain and the boy to their fate. You owe them nothing. Survive. Arion was flooded with a paralyzing terror, the absolute certainty that another step would mean his own dissolution, a primal, animalistic urge to let go and flee. Live, your life is your own. But the cord held. Kaelen saw the vision and snarled, his defiance turning on the island itself. He would not be told who he was by a hungry rock. He pushed harder, his loyalty a physical force. Arion felt the terror, but he also felt Kaelen's solid presence in front of him and the faint, failing warmth of Lykon's hand. He held on, his hope now a stubborn, tear-streaked refusal to abandon his crew. They hit the core. There was no sound of impact, no shattering of crystal. There was only contact. The moment the Kephalos, glowing with its tri-colored storm, touched the crystalline surface of the heart, a profound and absolute silence fell over the cavern. The frantic heartbeat stopped mid-beat. The psychic scream cut off. The Kephalos acted not as a hammer, but as a conduit. The dissonant chord of their humanity, Kaelen's bitter refusal to yield, Arion's desperate hope for the dawn, Lykon's solemn acceptance of his end, poured directly into the ancient monolithic consciousness of the island. The crimson light within the core did not explode, it curdled. The pure, hungry red was polluted by the violent swirl of red, yellow, and violet. The island entity, which had only ever known the simple notes of existence, hunger, stillness, consumption, was flooded with the incomprehensible music of paradox. It was being shown grief and joy, hatred and love, despair and hope, all at once. It was a consciousness of stone being forced to comprehend the soul of a man, and the concept was so alien, so utterly antithetical to its nature, that its very being came undone. The crimson light turned the color of dried blood, then a dead, lusterless gray. A network of black fractures spread across the core's surface, not from the point of impact, but from within, as if its own heart had turned to poison. With a final, shuddering sigh of stone, it went dark. The light in the Kephalos vanished. The stone in Lykon's hand turned to gray, inert dust, sifting through his fingers. The power was gone. The connection was broken. Lykon crumpled, his body utterly spent. Kaelen and Arion caught him, lowering him gently to the floor. The cavern was groaning, the sound of a beast dying. The remaining veins holding the dead core snapped, and the great gray sphere crashed to the floor, shattering into 1,000 dull shards. The ceiling was cracking, and huge slabs of rock began to fall, their impacts shaking the very foundations of the island. "Lykon!" Arion cried, shaking his captain's shoulder. Lykon's eyes fluttered open. The feverish light was gone, leaving only a deep, profound calm. The violet of his sacrifice had been spent. He looked at Kaelen, then at Arion, and a faint, peaceful smile touched his lips. He had seen his wife's face in his moment of doubt, her expression full of pity. Now he imagined he saw her again, but this time she was smiling with pride. He had been strong enough. "The storm," he whispered, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. He reached up, his hand trembling, and clasped Kaelen's forearm. His grip was surprisingly firm. "Get him home, Kaelen. Your watch now." His hand fell away. His eyes slid closed. The last breath eased out of him, a quiet, final release. Lykon, the broken captain, was gone. A slab of rock the size of a small boat crashed down nearby, sending a shower of stone fragments over them. Kaelen stared at his captain's still face for a heartbeat, his own expression a mask of grief and shock.
The old sailor, who had seen so much death, had not been prepared for one to matter so much. "He's gone, boy," Kaelen said, his voice rougher than ever. "And we will be too if we stay." He pulled Arion to his feet. The boy was sobbing, his body limp with grief. Kaelen shook him, not gently. "Weep on the boat. You can't honor his sacrifice by dying with him. Move." He half-dragged, half-carried Arion away from the center of the collapsing chamber, back toward the tunnel. They scrambled over the rubble of the shattered core, the dead heart of a dead god, and plunged into the darkness of the passage. The island was in its death throes, the very rock groaning as the ancient power that had held it together dissipated. The crystalline bridge was gone, but the chasm was now choked with rubble from the collapsing walls, forming a treacherous, unstable path they could cross. They ran, fueled by adrenaline and terror, through a world that was now just rock and darkness. The passages that had been filled with a malevolent intelligence were now merely caves, stripped of their power, their silence no longer menacing, but empty. They burst out of the tunnel entrance into the gray twilight of the cove. The unnatural stillness was gone, replaced by the roar of the wind and the crash of waves. But it was a different sound. The storm was still powerful, but it was a natural fury now, not the focused, intelligent rage of a god. High above, through the swirling clouds, a pale sliver of moon was visible. They scrambled into the longboat, Kaelen's powerful arms rowing them away from the cursed shore with desperate, rhythmic strokes. As they rounded the headland, they saw it. The island was sinking. The central peak, where the core had resided, was collapsing in on itself, a great plume of steam and dust rising into the sky. The sea boiled and churned around its shores as it succumbed to the waves it had so long commanded. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, the island of Ethel was gone. All that remained was a treacherous shoal and a lingering mist on the water. The storm broke with the rising sun. The oppressive gray ceiling of clouds tore apart, and a single defiant spear of golden sunlight cut through, illuminating the churning gray sea. Kaelen shipped the oars, his body trembling with exhaustion. Arion, huddled in the bow, finally stopped crying, his gaze fixed on the impossible, beautiful light. The air tasted clean, sharp, and blessedly empty. Kaelen moved to the stern and took the tiller, his hand resting on the familiar wood. He looked at the boy, whose face was stained with tears and rock dust, but whose eyes, for the first time, held the quiet resilience of a man. They were the last of the Triton's daughter, the only two who knew the truth of what lay beneath the waves. "He saved us," Arion said, his voice quiet. "Aye," Kaelen replied, his gaze on the new horizon. "He did." They did not speak of glory, nor of the wrath of gods, nor of the horrors in the dark. There were no words for it. Their victory was not a triumphant song, but a long and heavy silence, shared between a bitter old man who had found someone to protect, and a young boy who had found the strength to hope in the deepest darkness. Together, under the wide, clean sky, they turned the boat for home, leaving the ghosts of gods and men to the mercy of the sea.